Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Community and Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I will start the meeting via inviting nominations for chairman for the 2022-23 municipal year. Are there any nominations?
I'd like to nominate Peter Dennis.
And do you have a seconder? Michelle. Are there any other nominations for chairman? No. Can I just have a show of hands for Peter Dennis? 5, 4. Against? And abstentions? Thank you very much. I will hand over to Peter to take us through the remaining business. Completely up to you.
Okay. Difficult to see you all, but here we go. So the next then is appointment of the vice chair. Thank you. So do we have nominations for vice chair? Al?
I'd like to nominate David Cornish.
Okay. Seconder? Chris? Okay. Any other nominations? No. Okay. Put it to a vote. So for David as the vice chair. Okay. Against? Abstain? Okay, great. Thank you. The next item is minutes of the previous meeting. As we're all new members, apologies. Apologies for absence.
Yes, apologies from David Cornish, chair, and Rochelle Shepherd-Bay is substituting this evening.
Yeah, okay. Now moving on to minutes of the previous meeting. As we're all new members here, apart from Shirley, yes, apart from Shirley. So I think we'll just take some guidance from Shirley in terms of approving those minutes, and then we'll take it to a vote.
Yeah, I just picked up a couple of things. I read them through again today, and page 10, last but one paragraph. There's the paragraph that starts, what were the call-out rates for fires compared to other incidents? And the last line of that, it was noted that it would be useful for members to see the full data breakdown. And I don't think we've seen that. We saw the presentation that was sent out to members after the meeting, but I don't think we've had that information that was requested.
I will double check that, Shirley, and yeah. I will chase it if it hasn't been sent.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And page 13, third paragraph from the bottom, it says, it was noted that issues relating to commercial processes, construction sites and water supplies were covered by environmental purposes for some commercial processes. So I watched the video again, and actually it should be permits, not purposes. But that was the only two items I could find.
So in summary, you're happy with that?
Yeah, other than that, happy with the.
So I'll take it to a formal vote. So everybody in minutes. So I'll take it to a formal vote. Everybody in favour of the minutes? Yeah. Yeah, I know. We'll just do that. We were taking it on the advice of Shirley that the minutes are there. She's pulled out 2 corrections. So you can. Yep. Okay.
Actually, just out of interest, Callum, who signs the minutes?
The
new chair
will.
signs them,
yeah.
Regardless of the fact that they weren't here.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, declarations of interest. Anybody got a declaration of interest? No. Okay. Moving on to public questions. Number
None
6.
received, Chair.
Number 7, member question time.
Again, none received, Chair.
Right, item number 8, working on domestic abuse update. So I'll pass this over to Narendra.
Hello, good evening, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Narendra Brar. I am the community safety lead for the borough, and prepared this report together with the domestic abuse coordinator, Karen Evans, for members to to consider. So the report in the pack for the papers today gives an overview for members for comment on the domestic abuse contract, and was requested some 6 months or so ago, following the approval and agreement of the Wokingham Community Safety Domestic Abuse strategy, which was agreed for a period of 3 years and ratified by members at that point. So this report is an update on that strategy, and also an update, just overview and an update of the current position of the domestic abuse current commissioned contract and where we are with respect to that. So just taking members through the report. If you just bear with me, I'm just having some technical issues with loading it up, so I'm just going to do that for you now. Just bear with me, sorry. There we are. Apologies. Hopefully members can all see that on their screen now. Is that okay?
Yes, thanks, Narinder.
Super. So as the report says, domestic abuse affects around about 2,700 women and 1,500 men in the Wokingham borough. And the domestic abuse strategy was agreed for a 3-year term for taking us up to the period of 2024. The strategy itself clearly sets out our response with respect to our statutory duties, which came online in line with Part 4 of the Domestic Abuse Act, which came in 2021. And those duties primarily concentrate really our focus on safe accommodation. So those duties were very much centred around focusing our response to safe accommodation. With respect to Cranston, Cranston is the current commissioned contract provider for Wokingham, and a new 5-year contract at that point was agreed last year, which was a 5-year contract with an option to extend for a 1+1 on that commissioned contract, subject to satisfactory performance. So the recommendation for the committee today is to note the report and to provide any comments with respect to the contents. Just taking members through the background of the report. So the contracted service, the Domestic Abuse Support Service, includes a helpline for individuals and practitioners, so they can call in and ask for advice. Its outreach is part of the service, so independent domestic abuse advocates support victims, and also the service provides group-based support and support for children and young people, as well as a perpetrators intervention programme for those perpetrators that have clearly indicated that they recognise their abusive behaviour and have expressed an interest in undertaking a perpetrator programme to address and change that behaviour. So the service previously was provided by Berkshire Women's Aid for a long period of time before It was awarded to Cranston in 2021, and during the year, so the report itself has some figures and facts and figures through it. So during the year, 216 victims of domestic abuse received safety planning and advice. So in addition to this domestic abuse service, there's also a 3-bedroom refuge within the borough. For those victims that express the want and the need to access refuge provision, we have a refuge within the borough which is run by Berkshire Women's Aid and is a 3-bed refuge placed within the borough. Funding was received last year with respect to us completing our Domestic Abuse Act duties. So with that, we received a pot of funding from government, and that funding was utilised for us to be able to deliver our duties with respect to the Part 4, Section 4 duties that came down in line with that Act. Like I said, specifically concentrating around safe accommodation. So really specifically around safe accommodation as opposed to concentrating on the wide variance of domestic abuse work stream. So one of the things that the funding is enabling us to do is to undertake a Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance accreditation, and this is the gold standard for housing providers in terms of the response that we give to domestic abuse victims wanting to access housing in the borough. So that's one of the things that we've been able to do with that funding. The other thing is for us to be able to run a pilot, a 1-year pilot with a service provider called Hourglass, and that's provision specifically targeted to elder abuse. So those that are 60 plus have got a specialist dedicated pilot service for a 1-year period linked to abuse around that particular cohort of victims. So there's data within the report specifically outlining some of the targeted individuals and particular groups, including the LGBT plus community, as well as information around the underrepresentation of males accessing the service. This was one of the things that's been brought out in terms of some of the research and some of the papers that we've looked at locally, and also some of the evidence-based information that we've been addressing locally. The majority of victims, so 52%, were in the age range of 25 to 44 years old, and the perpetrators, yes, so the majority of victims were in the age range of 25 to 44, as were the perpetrators also were in this age range. So this is our key sort of age range for victims and perpetrators. And then in addition, there's data contained within the report that outlines police incidents that were attended, and then some ethnic minority information and some ethnicity information around those particular incidents that the police attend in terms of domestic abuse, and the ethnicity data that we've been able to establish from that data cohort. And then just taking you quickly through the report in terms of the sort of outlining a summary of some of the information and the action plan actions that have been undertaken in terms of the action plan is also contained there for members to look through. I won't take you through it page by page, because I'm sure you've had a sort of detailed read through. And in terms of the analysis of issues, also like to outline that we've created in the last year to support the delivery of the domestic abuse strategy. We've created a partnership board and a networking group the networking group, which has over 30 plus members of local services delivering services, different services across a broad range of provisions across the borough, come together in terms of the networking group. And then there's a domestic abuse partnership group, which is the strategic group looking after the delivery of the domestic abuse strategy 2021-24. So the commission service has been in place now for just over 9 months, and all elements within the commission service are being delivered, with the exception of refuge provision, which is being delivered via Berkshire Women's Aid, and the report contains some information within it around that too. So I think at that point I'm going to stop and take questions, if that's okay.
Yep. Who wants to start the questions? Shirley? Sorry, Laura.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Peter. First of all, I'd just like to thank you, Narinder, for all the hard work that you and your team have been doing on domestic abuse. I know you've been doing a colossal amount of work, and you're very ambitious and got high standards for the council, which is brilliant. I've got 4 questions, if you'll indulge me, Chair, but I promise they'll be quick ones. So first of all, I was quite shocked at Woodley having nearly 1 in 4 reports of domestic abuse, and I wasn't quite sure where Fields was, which is referenced in the paper. So I wondered if there was a wider breakdown so we can see how many were in Early, how many were in Woking Town, Twyford, just so we can get a sense of comparison and where the focus needs to be.
Yeah, thank you very much. We can, Laura, get some more detailed breakdown of the information within incident data. So that is something that we're looking at for an ongoing quarterly basis for us to understand exactly where our where the incidents are. So that is something that we're doing at the moment. It's really it's a question for the data analysis that we have in place. There's a huge pull on that data sort of resource at the moment. So breaking down the data to a more detailed, granular level is certainly part of the plan, and something we'll be doing going forward for us to really understand the nature and the breakdown of the borough and exactly where we need to concentrate some education, provision, and sort of targeted information as part of ongoing work.
Thank you. They'll be useful for members to see. And then secondly, I wonder if you've had a thought about perhaps bringing this topic to the Residence Equality Forum. Arif Sain, as the council officer, he leads on it. It might be something that you'd want to recommend to them. I know that you're focusing a lot more on domestic abuse when it comes to elderly people and LGBT, which is welcomed, but it would be great to just get the local communities and their insights into this topic too.
Yeah, absolutely. So all focus in terms of community and in terms of victims with protected characteristics is absolutely, we are really live to that in terms of barriers to accessing services locally. So the Equalities Forum is definitely a place where we'll be taking this agenda, because there is a whole range of different communities which we do not wish to homogenise in any way, shape or form. So absolutely the Equalities Forum is front and centre of where we want to bring some of this work to close work in partnership with.
Great news, thank you. And then I know this is simply an update, but I wondered if you had any KPIs that perhaps we could see at a later update, because that would be really useful for members to see.
Yep, so we're developing a suite of KPIs sort of as we speak, and we certainly do anticipate bringing those to yourselves at a later date. Like I've said, we're really working on tightening and really sharpening sort of the data around this area of work to be able to understand sort of the needs and the evidence base locally. So absolutely, we can bring that back at a forward date.
Thank you, Narinder. And then finally, can you confirm that anyone escaping domestic abuse in the borough, no one was turned away who needed help?
No, I can absolutely confirm that we have. So within the report, there's information about the 3-bed refuge that we have currently within the borough as a provision. But over and above that, there is housing legislation and homelessness legislation that means and enables us to absolutely capture as a safety net anybody wishing to flee their accommodation and access safe accommodation through the council. So I can confirm that nobody wishing to access safe accommodation has not been turned away.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Shirley's next, but Gregor, did you have a point to raise against those? Okay, after Shirley. Shirley then.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Norinda. I've got a few questions. I'll take them one at a time, like Laura did, if that's okay. In June 2021, when the Community Safety Partnership announced the new contract, it said that the contract also provides for work with schools for young people who are the victims of domestic abuse or had witnessed domestic abuse. And I just wondered how that's coming along, how it's working, because I didn't seem to see anything specific relating to that in the report.
Yes, so schools work with young people is part of the Commission's service. It has been a little bit delayed in getting off the ground, in that it is quite a specialised area of work. So trying to get a specialist individual around that area of work has been quite challenging. We did manage and have managed, and Cranston did absolutely successfully recruit a young people's worker. Unfortunately, soon after that particular individual has gone on maternity leave, so there are plans afoot currently as we speak to get that play therapy and also one-to-one counselling and drama therapy and counselling therapy back on track and delivered as we speak. So there are plans afoot to make sure that there is no gap in provision whilst that maternity leave is comes to an end, which will be January next year.
Okay, thank you. And on page 18 of the report, it speaks about, on page 18 of the strategy, it speaks about perpetrator interventions available for those who self-identify that they need to address their abusive and controlling behaviours. And I just wondered how successful that has been so far, and have you got any figures for the number of perpetrators who have come forward to have counselling and help?
There are figures, and I can circulate those. I can make sure that those are circulated with the minutes for members to have a look through. It's been quite again a challenging start to the perpetrator programme, but it is now established and in place, and we are seeing successful outcomes for those perpetrators that have wished to engage in them. Like I said, I don't unfortunately have the numbers to hand, but I'm more than happy to ensure that they're circulated with the minutes.
Great, thank you. And in the report, you talk about the and you mentioned the Independent Domestic Violence Advocate Service, and I just wondered how that works in principle. Does this advocate, is it the person on the end of a phone, or are there face-to-face meetings? How does that work? How does that work in practice?
Yeah, sure, I can cover that. So independent domestic advocates or advisors, sometimes they're called, so IDVAs for sort of acronym short. They will be allocated to an individual once they are risk assessed. So a risk assessment will be undertaken, and then they will be advocated a IDVA. IDVAs will work flexibly with victims, so if they prefer to have a face-to-face meeting, they can undertake that. If they prefer to have a telephone call, in the recognition that victims can often be accessing support and help without the perpetrator's knowledge. And so we'll work with the victims in a way that it is safe for them to do so. So if that's, you know, in a coffee shop or on a lunch break during work time, or, you know, at a doctor's surgery, or in another place where, you know, the victim has made an excuse sometimes to be able to go out and see an IDVA, then that is the way the IDVA will work. It will very much be on a case by case basis, dependent on individual situations and what's safe to do so.
Okay, so did you say that it hasn't really got off the ground yet? It has got off the ground.
Yeah,
right, sorry, misheard then.
No, the IDVAs are absolutely, IDVAs are front and centre of the services being provided. So they have been in place since day one, working with victims in that way, providing support and also providing safety planning and signposting to other additional services and provision that we have within the borough. Okay,
thank you. And you mentioned that there are 30 plus partner organisations in the borough who are supporting the strategy. It'd be quite interesting, I think, just out of idle curiosity, really, to see a list of those 30 organisations. Which I think would be quite interesting to members. And I believe that you were sent some questions ahead of the meeting, and I don't know whether you'd had a chance to look at those and to address those particular questions.
I was sent some questions ahead of the meeting, and I am able to pick them up, and also I can circulate a written response to those questions as well. So I don't know how perhaps I could revert back to the chair and see how the chair would like me to address those.
I think for fairness, I think we need to allow everybody else to know what those questions were. So I've got some copies here. I'll give you folks. I would like a verbal thing, but I think we also need a written report. But before we go on to those, I'd like Gregor to ask his question, and then Rochelle. Thank you. And then Pauline.
Narinder, thank you for the presentation and for the paper that you've put together. Very supportive of what it says. I wanted to ask you a question, though, which is, it's a tragic reality of modern life that, unfortunately, there is a high possibility that some of the Ukrainians that are currently coming to live in our community are going to be housed in residences where domestic abuse is present, but currently either unreported or unrecognised. Now, having read through the report that you've provided, I wanted to ask, in light of this and the Ukrainians coming to our community, what additional actions are you taking? What additional interventions do you believe will be required? And what additional facilities, for example, refuges, do you think will be required in order to ensure that anybody that is coming to live in our community, either as a guest or on a long-term basis, is safe from domestic abuse?
Yes, thank you. So we've been working very closely on a number of different topics in terms of the introduction of Ukrainians into Ukrainian refugees into our communities locally. There's been a number of different sort of issues that we've been live to. One is clearly the modern slavery agenda and the possible linkages into exploitation, but equally so, we've also been concerned about that sort of exposure to domestic abuse and domestic violence. So we've undertaken a number of different steps. There's been information provided and translated in different languages for Ukrainian communities and our Ukrainian guests to access and get to know really in terms of our culture what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable in terms of behaviour, what constitutes certain behaviours. So that which is the norm or culturally acceptable to Ukrainians, for example, wouldn't necessarily translate to our communities. So really being clear about that educational piece to them about what constitutes acceptable behaviour and what doesn't, and what constitutes domestic violence and also exploitation and modern slavery, and a number of other different sort of topic areas that we've been made quite live to from our sort of international and foreign office colleagues. We've also undertaken some clear training with our case workers. So the case workers that are working currently with the guests in terms of bringing them up to speed and giving them some real clear training about what to do or how to recognise particular behaviours or particular indicators that they may themselves become live to, and want to then ask some more sort of questions, delving questions into individuals, and also recognising and telling our guests that the police and other uniformed people, including officers from the council, you know, are here to assist and help, and can be accessed and can be engaged in conversations without fear of without fear of a number of different things. So really trying to break down those barriers and provide that educational piece, and also signpost in terms of where additional help and information could be sought.
Thank you for that, Narinder. Chairman, can I suggest perhaps that in 6 months' time a report comes back to this committee reviewing the situation specifically in relation to visitors coming in from Ukraine, any domestic abuse interventions that have had to take place, any actions, any additional facilities that have been required in provision for particularly that community. I really hope that that report says we haven't had to do anything and it becomes the shortest report in Woking Borough Council's living memory. I fear that that won't be the case, although I really hope that it is. But I do think this is something that we should be looking to review on an ongoing basis.
Rochelle.
What percentage of the victims return to the same place that they left, and how successful, in other words, are they being a return offender? Are they coming back again in 6 months or a year? Just of interest. And second of all, how many of the offenders are serial offenders? It's not the first time they've done this. Some parts of other places in the world have lists of people who you probably don't want to get involved with, is about the best description I can say, because they have been abusive. They've been abusive in other cases, and more than one case, or more than 3 cases, or more than 5 cases. And it is something that women look for at times to make sure they don't wind up with somebody who seems very nice to begin with and has a record, let's put it this way.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of talking about people or evidencing or giving numbers around victims going back to the same place or the same perpetrator, that is you know, that isn't currently data that we collect. Nationally, there is research, and globally there is research done on the topic, and we have to extrapolate from that information that's available, really, if I'm honest with you, because all of the research and all of the information that's available to us says that there is a high prevalence, unfortunately, of victims repeating their want and their find in similar types of partners. So where you know a victim has been with an abusive partner, we do find that pattern of them in a new partner is replicated, and it can be replicated quite often, and it isn't something that is unusual to see in victims, and it is not unusual to see in perpetrators either. So whilst there is huge amounts of work from the perpetrator's perspective that we do in terms of breaking the cycle of abusive relationships and harmful behaviours in relationships, so really trying to educate and give information about what a healthy relationship or what a safe relationship looks like. You know, the absolute data around it isn't easy to source, but like I said, in terms of information that we do have, we rely really heavily on some of that sort of empirical information and quite sort of global information and national research that's done on the subject matter.
The database as well, possibly, but also how many, come up with the right answer, for right question for this. How many women repeat continually this? You say a number of them do this. How many really escape? And how many have history from their own upbringing of abuse? And does that mean it's more likely to get an abusive relationship?
Unfortunately, yes. So I can answer again. I'm not going to give any sort of figures because I'd have to double check and look them up in terms of what they say nationally, regionally, and sort of globally for us in terms of an absolute position. But unfortunately, the sad, tragic truth is that those individuals that experience domestic abuse as children do go on to then repeat the behaviour. So in males, we will find that actually they become perpetrators of domestic abuse, and in females, we typically find, and this is absolutely generalising because it is not that straightforward, but and in females, we will find that they are more prevalent to being or engaging in a abusive relationship. So really, that is why there is an absolute essential need for us to really understand and really tackle domestic abuse in children, or children as victims of domestic violence themselves, experiencing it and living in a household where domestic abuse has occurred, because of the harmful effect of them then going on into adult life, either repeating that behaviour or it having such an effect on them. So, and that is why in the Domestic Abuse Act, children are now recognised as victims within their own right. So in terms of our duty has massively now changed as of last year, as a statutory body, as a statutory authority, we now have a duty to see children as victims in their own right and put services and help and assistance in place for those children to help that sort of cycle to be broken.
Okay, moving on to Pauline.
Thank you, Chairman. Couple of questions actually. Where do you get the most referrals from? Is it mostly from the police? I mean, what are the channels for getting referrals? And in particular, what is your duration between getting a referral and actually doing something about it? What sort of lag is there? Because obviously, I would have thought with a lot of these things, it's very important to be quick.
Sure. So the majority of the referrals come from three main places, but two in particular. So the police, as you've clearly identified, and social care. So generally, adult or children's social care can be the two main referral paths. And then thirdly, self-referrals as well. So people can access, and victims do often, can clearly refer themselves. And do often reach out to services to gain that additional assistance for themselves as well. But the two main spaces or places are social care and the police.
Thank you for that. And what is your SLA, for want of a better word, between a referral and actually taking some action?
Yeah, so I will come back to you on that, because the SLA sort of service level agreement changed when we put the new contract in place, and we actually we increased the speed at which victims were contacted. So I don't want to give you the wrong information. So I will ensure that the correct SLA and the details are put in the notes for you, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great. And if you could also tell us what your performance against that SLA is, that would be good. And the other question I had was, how much does this service cost to run at the moment? And you mentioned government funding. What proportion of it is funded by the government?
Is this the commission service?
It's the domestic abuse service as a whole?
Yes. So the Domestic Abuse Commission service, again, I'm able to give you sort of figures that are broken down. The overall contract price, I can sort of break down and put down for you. There are different elements to the service. So the refuge is funded, so the 3-bed refuge is funded separately from the actual commission service. So we have 2 different elements to the service, and I'm happy to put those figures round for yourself, no problem.
Thank you. And what I'd like to know is the total cost of the service. So I'd like to include not only what you commission, but also your internal costs. So how much does it cost Woking Borough to provide this service in total? And how much of that is funded by the government? And if you can split it by the different elements of the service, that would be great. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, you pointed out, Steve, if you could go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I appreciate the question from Pauline, and just trying to be fair to Narinder. I'm just going to walk away with something she's going to struggle to do. I think your last question, Pauline, is fair in relation to what's the total system cost to the council. I think trying to capture that, understanding the social work contact, because DA as a problem is going to touch every part of the organisation. So what Narinda's got is a very specialist lens in which she operates through, and we work with the Community Safety Partnership, and we can give you those figures because it's contracted out, and we can look at the time, the resources in Narinda's team. When we start to look to try to evidence what sits in other parts of the organisation, which is captured under DA, is extremely difficult to do. It is probably a worthwhile exercise for us to try to map, so I appreciate that, but I think the ability of us getting it very accurate will be very difficult because it's probably changing on a day-to-day basis as well. So it's a good question, and it's certainly something we should think about and be able to come back to talk to you about the total system cost approximately, which will probably be considerably more than what Narinda will tell you the contract is. But I think that's a challenge for us to take away and come back to you on. That's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think what I was trying to get at was the cost of the domestic abuse service. I don't particularly want the cost of your element of all the social workers and your element of all the police and all that stuff. I mean, I think that would take you far too long to calculate to be valuable. You're going to have these people anyway. What I'm interested in is the total cost of Narinda's service, including the people that are dedicated to abuse, and how much of that is funded by the government.
Yeah, we should be able to pull that together reasonably quickly for you, Pauline. Thank you.
I could say that looking at the cost, how much is a woman's life worth?
So I know we've got the questions that has been sent to you before. I've got some questions myself to ask, and then what I'll do, I'll kind of read out those questions, and you can give us a quick verbal answer on those, but then I expect a kind of written replies just to save for time. Going through some of the answers you gave, part of this question relates to Pauline's one, is about the funding costs or funding we get from the government, and is that going to be ramping up as time goes on? Because we know from your figures that we've got increased issues occurring, so that's going to include increased costs. Do we have a projection based on that? That's one question. Do we have occupancy level for the residents, the refuge? So again, I note that the figures again are increasing, and are we going to be hitting the capacity of that refuge in the near term or short term? And if so, do we need to look at some emergency level, say in 6 months' time, where we're going to need another accommodation point? Another question relates to Shirley's points about the school side of the fence. I'll identify it as a single point of failure, in that if we've got one person looking after that particular service and they've gone on maternity leave, that leaves a gap in provision. Do we have any plan for coverage or for Carston or whoever they are to provide coverage when we do have such an issue? So those are my immediate questions.
Yep, thank you, Chair. So in terms of funding, the government, we were expecting a 3-year settlement for the domestic abuse funding, but unfortunately they've only given us a 1-year settlement again this year. So last year we had something in the circa of £250,000 given to us to meet our duties that come down the line. And we have a similar figure that's been we've been able to draw down in terms of grant funding from the government again this year. So whether there is any plans to increase that, we haven't been told yet, but we would expect, as much as we can do, that we will be given a similar figure again next year, because it was, like I said, anticipated that it was going to be a 3-year funding settlement, and we were going to be given that in year 1, and then we would be able to plan for 3 years, as these things are quite difficult to plan sort of year on year in terms of security of service. So that's sort of sort of around the funding element, and I take your point. The difficulty we have at the moment, really, in terms of planning some of this, is the spike in services. So over the period of COVID, we did expect to see a sharp increase in the number of victims accessing domestic abuse services, because from all of the evidence and all of the anecdotal information we were hearing up and down the country, and also from other countries across the globe, was that domestic abuse had increased during the lockdown period. And that really, in terms of what we experienced locally in Wokingham, didn't come to fruition. So we didn't see a massive spike in the numbers of individuals accessing services. But what we have seen subsequently, since the loosening of lockdown, has been a steady increase in demand in services. So we've seen that steady increase in demand over the last, particularly over the last quarter. And we did expect that demand would tail off, but it seems, from all the evidence available both globally, nationally and locally, for us more importantly, that demand level doesn't look to be tailing off at all. In fact, that demand level seems to be increasing on a weekly and monthly basis. So we are seeing an increased demand in services above and beyond that which we expected as we came out of COVID, and that hasn't tailed off as we would have expected it to after victims had initially access the service. So that's sort of where we are. The funding isn't following from government in line with that increase in demand in services at this moment in time. Whether that will change, we have sent that up in terms of Nicole Jacobs. We have we have a networking group that feeds into the national group of domestic abuse commissioners. So we're seeing this sort of trend, and whether the funding sort of follows from government, like I said, there is no definite answer from that at the moment, but we are hoping that that is what is recognised in terms of the government putting the funding in place for us to help with that demand in services. Your second question around the refuge, do we have figures around occupancy rates? I can tell you, and I'm happy to circulate occupancy figures as an addendum to this agenda item, and the information that I've said I'll send round as part of this report and update. But the refuge, from the information that we have from meetings with BWA, I can inform you that the refuge is full constantly. It isn't at a point where it is empty or it is under occupied. The refuge is full. what I would also say about the refuge is that it is very often full with people, and this would be what we would expect from victims from neighbouring or other boroughs, because for our refuge locally, and as you would expect, it wouldn't necessarily, in fact, it probably wouldn't be safe for our local victims to go and access a local refuge, because if they are fleeing, they want to be away from the perpetrator and away from their immediate geographical location. So that refuge is occupied the majority of the time, and we would expect to have reciprocal agreements with other refuges in other places, so that our victims from our borough are able to access a refuge in another geographical location. So that's the sort of refuge position. And then your third question, Chair, I've forgotten about.
The third question was about single point of failures in service, where we're reliant on just one person.
So the that position is where we're at. So the commission service was to employ one children and young people's worker, and that's what the service provision and the service specification was, and that is what the contract is fulfilling at the moment. So whilst that person is on maternity leave at the moment, the temporary provision in service has been put in place, and there is a service that is running to be able to provide that in the meantime. So whilst that person is on maternity leave, to address that gap in service, alternative provision has been put in place in terms of a specialist play worker and counselling and therapy worker for children and young people. But again, what I would reiterate around this is that at that point, when we put that service specification and that service in, that was the expected demand on service provision. So what we're seeing at the moment is an increased service provision and an increased referral into that particular service as well. So even with one person in place, fully up and running, we would at this moment in time be expecting that demand for that service is going to be quite high.
Okay, thank you. I see Steve wants to jump in there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thanks, Narinda, for that answer. Just to add to what Narinda said, for clarity for the scrutiny panel, we've commissioned a contract that says we're required to have one FTE doing the specific amount of work. It's down to the supplier to make sure at any one time they've got that one FTE doing the work. So we would fully expect them, as part of their methodology of operation, to ensure they are planning for such eventualities such as absence, maternity leave, or whatever might occur. That's something as a client that we would expect of them. So just for clarity, we are buying a service that basically says we have the FTE working. Now, whether that's one individual, they spread that amongst two individuals, three individuals, is a choice for them as a supplier. We are commissioning a function that we expect to be delivered. So just for clarity.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
Yes, I just want to pick up on some earlier statements that were made about the number of refuge places and the requirement to ask other services within the borough to fill the gap effectively. Do you have any figures of for argument's sake, how many people are being pushed towards the social services for as homeless, using other facilities that might be assigned elsewhere? Is there a pressure on other services within the borough to accommodate the people requiring refuge and support?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, I was going to cover this actually. So it's a good question, and what we've seen, because obviously I've got housing under my remit as well. Those requesting safe accommodation, fleeing domestic abuse, has quadrupled in the last 6 months. So it puts it into context. Now to further put that into context, that's come from, I say inverted commas, because we would want it to be 0, but it's come from a relatively low base. So where we would have seen maybe 3 referrals during that period, and we've had to house, we've seen 11. So picking up Narinda's point earlier on about we're seeing this increase, is this a spike or is it a sustained situation, or is it going to further increase, is something we're monitoring very carefully. But there's no doubt about it, it's also putting pressure onto the housing service, our temporary accommodation and safe refuge and housing service as well. So simple answer to your question, Councillor, is yes. But we are meeting that demand. That's really important to highlight. No one's being turned away. People fleeing domestic abuse are a priority, and they are housed.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, what I'm going to do is just read out the questions you've had via email, so we get them minuted for documentation. If you then want to give a brief answer to some of those questions, then give a written report to those questions, that would be great, because I know people are listening to this, so they do have an expectation of some sort of answer. So I'll just read them out, but this is just for the minutes, to be honest. First question: who has been consulted and given input into this report, e.g. BWA, Kaleidoscope, Cranston? Number 2, the report acknowledges the need for more data and to compare with the census results to check for representations. I would agree. Of over 2,700 women and 1,500 men affected annually, what else do we know about them? Age, disability, LGBTQ+, ethnicity. How do these demographics impact the needs of the victims? Number 3, what are the different needs of male and female victims and other demographics? Are they being met? We heard that from Cranston, the difficulties in getting ethnic minority women to come forward. I think that's reflected by the numbers we're seeing in the report. Later in the report, it suggests that men are underrepresented when it comes to accessing services. But why is this? Perhaps their needs are different. Number 4, refuge provision. I know we've gone a bit into detail, a little bit woolly on what is being provided and how it is funded. I think it is clear that we need to get a long-term strategy in place for this, which considers current provision and future needs, which alludes to the stuff I asked earlier. Currently, there's no local refuge provision for families or those with complex needs. This is a gap that's been heard from Cranston, and has also been heard from Berkshire Women's Association previously. How are we currently meeting the needs of this particular demographic? Number 5, back to data and demographics. We are funding a pilot for support worker for older people. Is that correctly prioritised and best use of funds? Are there another group that's more, not important, but more impactful? Number 6, would like to know more about the networking group than the regular attendance. This goes to what Shirley asked earlier, representatives of the local domestic abuse services. What is this group? How often does it meet? Who attends, and what is its purpose and impact? Number 7, the final question. Are Cranston delivering according to what they're contracted for? Also, what specifically are the gaps on top of the currently commissioned service, and what is the process to find out, for example, the school's provision again that Shirley asked about? Thank you.
I can take a couple of those questions I think that we haven't already touched on. So I think probably one of the ones I'd like to cover is around complex needs and the basis to expand our accommodation strategy. We are very much working and looking to evidence and understand our local needs for domestic abuse victims coming forward. Absolutely, we recognise at the moment that we have a 3-bed refuge, and it can, in terms of the types of families it can host, or the types of families that are suitable to go into that accommodation, is very limited. So if you're a family of more than three children, so a mother with 3 children, you possibly are not suitable for that particular refuge. But also we want to understand what the need is. So what is the actual need and the ask of victims? We know nationally victims have told accommodation providers that actually they do that. What's off-putting for them in terms of accessing refuge is shared accommodation, so shared facilities that are pretty much like student digs are not something that they want to go and access. So not only are they in a massively acute traumatic experience, they're possibly being made homeless, but on top of that, you know, the refuge provision that they're going into isn't necessarily what is you know, appealing to them or necessarily comfortable to help aid their recovery journey or put them in a mindset that enables them to start thinking about their own recovery and trauma assistance. So what they're telling us is they would like self-contained accommodation and self catering type accommodation. So these are the types of standards of accommodation that we really want to, and we are really aspirational in terms of wanting to provide that sort of accommodation, which is good, recognised good practice, and that which victims are telling us that they want to see is able to assist them if and when they need to leave their home to flee a place of safety. So that's the type of model of accommodation that we are working with our local providers, with Berkshire Women's Aid, Cranston and Kaleidoscopic are key to these conversations that we're having locally, as well as sort of our more strategic housing partners, to start having that conversation about how we make that into, you know, that sort of plan, an aspirational plan, into a reality locally, so that we can assist victims in the best way possible. So that's sort of really some, you know, gives a little bit of an indication, I hope, around the types of aspirations we have in terms of the refuge provision locally. That's where we ultimately want to get to, and within that is the ability to be able to help complex cases. So that's where people have multiple issues, not just domestic abuse, but there may be mental health involved, maybe substance misuse involved, and there may be domestic abuse involved as well. So to be able to assist individuals and victims that have that sort of multitude layered needs. So that really is the sort of plan in terms of refuge provision. The other thing I would say in terms of the questions that you posed there, Chair, was around trying to help victims from protected characteristics, and there are multiple barriers for victims of protected characteristics in terms of coming forward and accessing services. So, for example, there is massive stigma around male victims accessing services. There's stigma around them not possibly being able to protect themselves, stigma around them actually being male victims themselves. So there are barriers in terms of not wanting to come forward and access services. And similarly with those from, for example, LGBT plus community, where they may not be openly of that particular community, and therefore they have added barriers to accessing assistance. In terms of ethnic minority individuals, again, there may be language barriers, there may be stigma in terms of cultural barriers, there may also be barriers in terms of individuals who don't have recourse to public funds and therefore wouldn't want to come forward because there may be a immigration related concern or concerns of a similar background. So what the point that I made sort of earlier is that when we say people of victims of protected characteristics, we're really keen to try and understand that each individual case is exactly that, an individual case, and individuals and victims have individual needs. And we in terms of setting up services and trying to understand those needs, that we are as broad and wide in understanding them as is possible, and not to try and homogenize those groups into one one particular pigeonhole or box in terms of trying to cater for their service, their needs, because they are very, very complicated and very, very wide in terms of what the ask is from those particular individuals.
Okay, thank you. I guess with the answers to the rest of the questions, you'll do a written reply to those. We do have 2 other questions in the room. Pauline first.
Thank you, Chair. I was just interested in how the reciprocal arrangements work. You painted a very eloquent picture of what people were looking for in terms of accommodation, which makes a heck of a lot of sense to me. But if you also, I think you also said that people didn't want to be accommodated in and around where they normally lived, and therefore quite often went out of borough, which also makes a lot of sense. So if you're gathering requirements from our borough's residents or views, how do you decide, how do you influence where that's placed? How do you make sure the demand is fulfilled if it's outside the borough? And how does this reciprocal arrangement work? You know, is it a, you know, we have 5 places, therefore we can only call on 5 places, or how does that work?
It does sort of work in that way. There is a national pool or a national database of refuge provision that only service providers and professionals have access to. And at any given time, when a victim is looking for refuge provision, I guess it's what occurs is a match with the victim's requirements. So if, for example, they say, we have family, I live in Wokingham, I have family in Liverpool, can I go to a refuge in Liverpool because I have family and friend support and access to assistance there, then refuge providers will go to that national pool and see whether they can access refuge provision there. And similarly, that pool of refuge provision is put together and reciprocal agreements occur. You know, we may in turn take somebody from the Liverpool area or another area where they have family or friends in Wokingham, and it is safe for them to want to and come to Wokingham. So in rough terms, that's sort of that's how the reciprocal agreement works. In reality, of course, there are also, there is no need for people to go that far afield. Sometimes it's a reciprocal agreement with our neighbouring boroughs, which is also happens quite often. So, we will take somebody from Reading or Bracknell, and Reading and Bracknell will take somebody from the Wokingham borough, because it means victims can go to a supermarket, without bumping into the perpetrator and that sort of thing, but but may still be able to take their children to the school where they're at, and also be able to continue going to work, and also continue having support from friends and family. So it can, like I said, and I can't labour this point enough, really, it really will depend on the individual victim's circumstances and what is right for them, and trying to cater to their wishes as best as possible.
Sorry, just to finish that question then.
Sorry, Pauline, just because it's more about how, it sounds like you're asking about how the domestic agenda works as opposed to scrutinising.
No, I wanted to get the final piece of that, which was, is there a, is it what you put in, when you assess the need, is it what you put in is what you can get out, or is there flexibility?
There is flexibility ultimately, and that is because of the nature of the service. So there is flexibility because of the nature of the service. So I guess it's a victim orientated service, and the assistance is there to help victims. So, but roughly speaking, if we have a 3-bed refuge, we will be able to keep a track of how many spaces, and how many individuals have from our borough accessed refuge outside of the borough. We can very often we have a good idea of the numbers of spaces taken elsewhere and the number of call on that. So it isn't as fixed as there's only 3 beds in Wokingham, we can only access 3 beds somewhere else. It's not that fixed. There is some flexibility in it.
Shirley?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Pauline and I were obviously on the same wavelength there, and I just wanted to sort of one further thing really is that once someone has left the borough, say a family have fled from the borough to, say, I don't know, West Berks or Liverpool or wherever it might be, do you then cease to have contact with that family and they are then entirely dealt with by the neighbouring borough's domestic abuse team, or do you still have, do you have any kind of contact with that neighbouring borough? And is there a kind of standard for refugees in terms of the type of, the quality of accommodation, if you like? You were saying earlier about how we're being very aspirational as a borough to get really, really good accommodation. And I'm just wondering, is that the same? Are all boroughs aspirational in that way? And do you ever get a chance to look at the accommodation that's in neighbouring boroughs and make sure that it is of a good standard? Thank you.
So there isn't a quality standard applied for refugees across the board. That's sort of they vary in the quality of the type of accommodation that is available. Do we get a chance to go to other boroughs to have a look? Yes, absolutely. We get a chance to go to other boroughs and have a look at the refuge provision that is on offer for individuals. And we also get a chance to go to sort of newer accommodation that's been sort of more purpose built to go and have a look as well. So yes, we is the short answer. We do get to go and have a look to sort of satisfy ourselves as to the standards, but there is no standardized quality, if you like, of the accommodation on offer.
And I'd also asked if once someone's left the borough to go to another place, is that the end of your team's contact with them, or do you still continue to liaise with those people, or at least with the other borough?
So that for a period of time we will continue to liaise, and then dependent on whether it appears that the move is going to be more permanent as opposed to temporary, then there will be a handover undertaken with a number of different agencies. So Children's Social Care, if appropriate, the local MARAC, which is the multi-agency risk assessment conference, chair will be informed about high-risk individuals moving into the borough, and that handover process will happen with those local, and also the local domestic abuse provider will also be informed, and there will be a handover as well of those particular cases if and when appropriate. So we keep hold of them for a period of time until it is appropriate to do so, and do that very tight information sharing handover.
Right, thank you very much. I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, quick scan of the room. Looks like we're done with the questions there. So I'll say thank you very much for your time. Nice to see the report, and we look forward to seeing the written answers to some of those questions. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Narinda. Okay, moving on to the next item, which is the Place and Growth Directorate Priorities, agenda item 9. So that's me, Steve.
It is.
Hi, Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for interjecting there earlier on, trying to support Narinda on what is a very important topic, and something that's obviously very challenging for us and elsewhere, and demand obviously increasing in the system as well. But Narinda's team's doing a fantastic job, and I think she's done very well there this evening. So attached in the report, you've got a list of, I suppose, the key activities, key things, I suppose, that's going to go on in Place and Growth over the next 12 months. I don't aim to go through them all, but what I thought I would do is share with you From my perspective as the director, what some of the key hot topics are that you might wish to consider diving into and scrutinising a bit more over the next 12 months. Now, obviously, you don't have to agree with me, but these are the things that sort of keep me awake at night, should we say, and the things that certainly get my attention. So not in any particular order, we're seeing a significant increase in homelessness presentation, which is primarily driven out of two elements. One we've just spoken about, which is domestic abuse, which is on an upward trend. But two, and by far the biggest percentage, is landlord evictions out of the private rented sector. This is something, I suppose, a fear that was going to happen post the lockdown situation and the pandemic, and is obviously being exacerbated by the increase in inflation and living costs. So this is a demand that's going to go up. The team in housing are working extremely hard to come up with preventative measures. It's very difficult to deal with demand in the short term, but what we can do is deal with the unit costs and so on in relation to trying to access more landlords to come forward to work with us as a local authority, and obviously get our registered providers to offer more provision as well. And we've made some really good inroads into sustaining some of the costs within that area. But I think it's fair to say that certainly in the 12 months I've been here, when I spoke to some of the housing staff, looking back a further 12 months from there, the demand on housing services coming through the door was pretty low. And there's been a significant increase over the last 2 years, and it's now rapidly increased over the last 6 months. So I think that is a very hot topic. I think it's a high risk area. And I think it's something you may wish to consider as an agenda item. You might want to dig into a bit detail and find out what we're doing to try and address those issues, including early intervention and prevention, which is going to be a key aspect of that. I'll go through these first and then obviously pick up any questions. The second one we sort of touched on, you'll find that a lot of these topics are they're interlinked, so they're not completely standalone. They're all connected. Some of the demands that happen within these things are created by other topics I'm going to mention. So this is just food for thought about how you might want to consider bringing some of these things together jointly. The second one is the refugee situation, and I raise that specifically because there's three aspects. Yes, we've got the current Ukrainian refugee situation, which has come up this evening. Gregor, you raised that one. And yes, there's DA pressures there potentially in relation to making sure people are not victims or exploited in any way. Modern slavery, Narinda mentioned, but there's other things associated there. But don't forget that the government scheme at the moment, the host scheme, is for someone to commit themselves for 6 months to host a family. So straight away, my eye is already on, well, what happens after 6 months? Where are these people going to go? Where's the housing provision? Can we sustain that tenancy within the borough? We've already spoke about all this other demand coming in housing at the moment, but this is potentially more demand that's going to come into the system and being ahead of the curve of that one. So that's one cohort. We've then got the Afghan refugees, which is another element of the refugee situation. Some of the pressures there created, again, on the housing system, not specifically about housing, but of course there's schools, places here that I know it's a different scrutiny on all those sorts of things. But again, it's pressure in the system. It's pressure in the system coming in. And the third one is the asylum seekers, of which we already have hotels. There's about 8 hotels across Berkshire that are housing asylum seekers. And at the moment, there's a struggle for move on accommodation there. So when you look at those three aspects, that's more demand coming in and is linked to the TA, to the homelessness, to all of those things. The third hot topic for me is what we just spoke about, which is domestic abuse. I sit on the Community Safety Partnership. I know the police are doing a lot of work. We've got an excellent borough commander, Narinda works very closely with, and this is absolutely a hot topic for them. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. So again, I think what you've discussed tonight, you've already said you want to see more reports coming back on this. more detail and information, which I think is spot on. And maybe linked to that, maybe Narinda can give an update on what she mentioned in the report, which is the DAHA accreditation, which is a Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance scheme where we're trying to get excellence in relation to the quality of housing that we provide to victims of DA. Changing tack slightly, but still very important, is bus routes. So for those of you that are not aware, obviously through the pandemic, public transport got hit hard. People were not going to work, people were not going to school, and so on and so on. And there was a lot of subsidy that came into the system in relation to supporting those bus service providers. And a lot of things in a lot of areas are getting back to normal. Bus services is not in a lot of areas. So at the moment, and for those of you that know, Rebecca Brooks is the absolute font of all knowledge in relation to this topic. And I glean all of my information from her. We're approximately up to, on average, and it does vary route to route, but approximately about patronage has returned to about 70% as what it was before. Now, you could argue, is that going to change in the next 12 months? Are more people going to get on buses again or not? I don't know. It's crystal ball gazing. But what we do know is the DFT have been funding the gap, and that funding is due to come to an end at the end of September. So, and the patronage is not picking up. So, and a lot of these are private sector route funded bus routes that a lot of people in the borough are dependent on. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scene with our providers, obviously mainly Reading buses, to look at opportunities where we could look at different ways we can still deliver the outcomes that our communities need in a more cost effective way, and so on. So rest assured that's going on. However, there's ultimately going to be a challenge here in relation to public bus routes going forward if the funding does drop off from DFT. So I think that is a very hot topic, and an immediate hot topic that you may wish to consider of diving into in greater detail. And as I mentioned, we're very fortunate to have Rebecca, who's an absolute expert in the area, to be able to update you on. The next one for me you might want to consider is progressing the local plan. So obviously the local plan's at a critical stage at the moment. It's still en route to examination. 23-24. The committee might want an update on the local plan, the status of it, understand a bit more about its purpose, and the options going forward. I won't say any more on that. I know it's been well debated, and most people are fully aware of the local plan and the process and the importance of it. The next one is a plea from Sally Watkins, actually, who's not here this evening. It's about the Customer Excellence Programme. Now, I think it's very critical for us, actually, because this is about us actually putting the customer at the heart of everything we do, actually changing the way we work. What does that mean in reality? How do we remodel the way we work? And so on and so on. So I think that's very important, and Sally was very keen for me to get that on the table with you this evening. She did say that Q3 onwards would be a good time for that, because it's still being worked up and we'll get momentum. So as we get to Q3, there'll be something more meaningful coming back to the committee that we'd be able to share with you. And last but not least, there's the Climate Emergency Action Plan, which currently sits with this committee, we all know it's a highly topical area that's got discussed a lot over the last year I was here, and obviously well before that, before I came. And members may want to consider whether they want the Climate Emergency Action Plan coming back to this committee and in what form. Now there's lots and lots of other things you could choose to talk about. That's me just sharing with you, I think, some of the immediate issues and some of the key issues and some of the high risk areas. There's the waste strategy, there's other things we could talk about, all sorts, but from being a director of the service, they're the ones that I think are the most critical that you may wish to focus on. Thank you.
Gregor.
Thank you, Chairman. Steve, just looking through your priorities there, and putting my former hat back on, One of the priorities, I think, particularly for your department, would be to create an energy strategy for our borough. We've seen energy prices rise significantly across the country and across the globe. We are in the process, or at least we had been in the process, of building a solar farm. We had plans in place to try and build 4 more across our borough. We need to take more control of our local energy generation, distribution, and storage. And I think one of the priorities that I would add to your list of, well, quite extensive list of priorities already, would be to really seriously sit down and think about how we are going to generate the electricity that we need in 2030, 2035 and beyond, bearing in mind that we're moving towards electric vehicles, that there is going to be a reduction in fossil fuel generated electricity across the country, et cetera, et cetera. The demands on electricity are only going to increase, and therefore electricity wholesale prices, having spoken with Ian Goff about this in a great amount of detail over the last few months and years, they're only going to increase over the next couple of years. There is no real view at the moment that they're going to start going back down again. So, yeah, I would add that to your list of priorities.
Thanks, Gregor. And Mr. Chairman, if I can come back, I know Graham's on the call, and I know it's something I was talking about with Graham this week, or Graham was talking to me about this week, about renewable energies to create electricity and all sorts. So absolutely, Gregor, it's something that we need to be alive to. I suppose my question would be, because what I'm trying to do is avoid duplication of your time and conversation. What I was mindful of, I suppose, over the last 12 months is, if you take the climate issue as an example, that probably got debated in a number of different forums. And there was a lot of duplication of officers going to different forums talking about the same thing repetitively. So I suppose my plea would be, if we can have a one conversation in the one committee about these sorts of things, it would make it easier and probably more meaningful to have a more holistic conversation. But I absolutely take your point, and I'll certainly take that away, Gregor. Thank you.
Pauline.
Thank you, Chairman. I think you'd probably expect me to say the first of these things, but I'll add one as well, another one as well. I think another priority has got to be road maintenance. It's the thing that we get most comment from residents about, whether it's paths or cycleways or roads. There's a lot of noise about that, and it's very important that we keep the quality up. Dealing with congestion is another one that fits with that. And I think the second item I'd like to see a bit more investigation and scrutiny on is the increasing of choice in terms of recycling. There's a definite amount of things that get recycled, so it's all my questions would be all around the waste service, the level of recycling, the frequency of the waste service, how effective it is.
Thanks, Pauline. Mr. Chairman, I'll come back on that. Yeah.
Yep.
So absolutely, the quality of the public highway is always going to be one of the #1 priorities to any resident, no matter where they are, where they live. And I'm always saying how good the quality of the public highway is in Wokingham relative to other areas. I think it is. It's certainly a lot better than where I live, I can tell you that. But it is something I think we need to look at, how we communicate what we do with road maintenance as well, and how we communicate to our residents in relation to dealing with customer interface. I think that's one of the challenges I've certainly picked up over the last 12 months. So I'm not sure whether is that linked into customer excellence and looking at how we engage with our customers, how we communicate more effectively, I suppose, with our communities and dealing with our customer inquiries when they come into the system. Because I see a lot of noise around the highway service that I think is avoidable with customer traffic. So I think I'd probably suggest that sort of we get underneath what we mean a bit more by road maintenance there, Pauline, I suppose. And if we're dealing with demand management in relation to that, well, what are those challenges coming in the systems, if you like? So I suppose the ask there is probably us being a bit more definitive about what we mean by road maintenance. I'll just part that one up for the moment, excuse the pun. Congestion, absolutely. So why are we dealing with congestion? Air quality, we start linking it back to climate again, you start linking it back to bus routes again. It's all connected. It all gets connected. This is what I'm saying. So having these conversations in isolation, I don't think sometimes is helpful. I think it's having a thematic look at something and then looking at all of the different component parts and all the benefits you're trying to realise out of the objective. And of course, all of these things ultimately, if you're looking with congestion, you're looking for buses, they do sit under climate, because that's the action plan that comes out of trying to get people out of their cars, trying to give them good alternatives to use and make different choices. And waste management, well, what I can tell you, again, it's a case of not reinventing the wheel. There is an active waste strategy that's ongoing at the moment out for consultation. So we've already reached out to the public and reached out to the public to say, what is it you would like to see? You know, linking it to climate, linking it to behavioural change, linking it to encourage people to participate more in the services we've got. And that information is being pulled together about what they'd want to see. So what I'd probably respectfully suggest there is when that consultation finishes and we get that information back, or how that waste strategy work moves forward, then it comes back to the committee, and then you can see what the public have actually said in relation to what they'd like to see going forward and what they think some of the solutions are, and then feed that into your thinking to inform what recommendations you'd like to make. So yes.
I'll just come back on the, I agree with you about the recycling and that one, that's fine. On the road maintenance and congestion, I think congestion is not just about climate. You could still have very frustrating congestion with 100% electric cars. We need to take congestion wider than just climate. It's not just climate. And with the road maintenance, what I want to see is to ensure that we continue to maintain the quality and start to deal with more of the residential roads and that sort of thing that have been left in abeyance for a long time, and we're now trying to pick up. So what I want to do is make sure that we're continuing that journey towards better maintenance so that we continue to be one of the best areas for road maintenance rather than the worst.
And if I might, Chair, just come back quickly on that. I think this is a good discussion, because we've got you're going to have Graham come in soon, obviously, and talk about what he's doing. But you'll be aware, you know, demand's going up in the system, costs are going up in the system, inflation's going up in the system. So when we go out to contract and re-procure our contracts, it's going to cost more for the same service. So all this demand and cost is going up and up and up. And so we have to be very clear about, well, members have to be very clear about how they wish to spend the money they have and what the priorities are, because there is no new money coming in the system and things are costing a lot more. So if we're going to spend more on domestic abuse, fantastic. If we're going to spend more on roads, it's great. We're going to spend more on building more housing for whatever. We're going to spend more on that money's, that choice has got to come in the backdrop of the financial landscape we have, because it has to be affordable. And obviously we can't spend money we haven't got. So again, it's about prioritisation, and that will be down to members to decide how in which they wish to spend that money. I think bringing all of these discussions and conversations and priorities together, and then looking at the budget envelope and what's achievable within what we've got, will be a good exercise as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Rochelle.
Several things. One, I believe that we should be asking for, rather than just having solar farms, you should be looking at having solar panels on every single roof of every single new building that's built in Woking. And we can, at that point, at least be a little bit more energy independent and reduce the cost to the average ratepayer for their electricity, because we're going to need more electricity anyway, and we can do it this way and also help the residents. Also, the levels of housing. I think we were going to level 4 or level 5 originally. We were proposing for the ecological basis on the housing, and we suddenly cut it back when the developers didn't want to produce houses that were that airtight or that efficient, let's say. It would make the houses a little bit more expensive, but it would be, on the long run, it would be better. Also looking at where we're building houses, and we're proposing to build 4,500 houses in a floodplain, which is not exactly the best thing in the world. These are the kind of things that we do have to look at as well.
Would you say that's covered under the local plan?
That's covered under the local plan, but I still want to mention it offhand because it's covered under Steve's area anyway.
Yeah.
Also, and lastly, for road maintenance, in the past, roads were estimated to live, let's say, be well for about 10 or 15 years or something like this, but the reality, roads can't last as long as we were planning to do it. We resurface roads about every 10 years, but it doesn't last that long. Or some roads were planning to last, they were not resurfacing every 25 years when they should have been resurfacing every 10 years. I realize we don't have the money to do this, but we still have to look at some of this. And lastly, looking at some of the new housing estates we're putting up where Woking is not providing a lot of services for them. A lot of the residents are going to be paying management fees. This is one of the things the local residents have been getting on to me about, that they're going to be paying a whole lot of management fees in addition to the council tax. But the council tax is not going to pay for their road maintenance, their maintenance of the trees in the area, maintenance of the land, maintenance of anything, or even the play areas. It's all going to be on them in addition to their council tax. What are we doing about that? Those are some of the other problems that are be coming up in the brand new estates right now. I realize developers don't want to pay us any money. They'd rather be able to get it out of the residents instead. But we have to do something about it for our residents.
Okay. Steve, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll whiz through really quickly. So I think the solar panel ones, I think picks up what Gregor was talking about the energy strategy. I think that would pick that up as part of our approach to renewables. Housing costs, really interesting debate. Probably not more for now, but I suppose the dilemma is we want to build more affordable housing, we want to build dementia care units, we want to build more SEND schools, we want to do all this sort of stuff. Yeah, it's all there, everyone keeps talking about it all the time. Well, that comes from developer contributions. If house building costs go up because we're specifying higher, there's less developer contribution and you can't do as much as all that other stuff. I'll just park that there for the minute because every decision you make will have a consequence somewhere. Okay, so it's not as if we can do everything and just tick everyone's box. So there will be trade-offs going on in all this conversation when you talk about housing development. Floodplain, yes, picked up as part of the local plan. It's a key part of the plan. There's got to be a strategic flood risk assessment in the local plan, so all that's addressed in there. Highways investment, yes, of course, you know, can always do more. I haven't looked nationally at the bill of highways at the moment, but last time, I think a couple of years ago, I looked. I think if you wanted to bring all the highway network in the country up to standard, it's about £16 billion deficit. So that's nationally. So it gives you an idea of the context of the level of investment required to get the roads where they need to be. And the adoption of highways, it's always a tricky one. It's not a Wokingham problem. It's something that happens in lots of places. So when a developer builds an estate, or whether they did, they may have an aspiration for the council to adopt it. The council will only adopt it if it's in an adoptable standard. Because why would we take on an asset that's not fit for purpose? Picks up your other point, Michelle, about having to repair things quickly or more quickly. So, and the council is not obliged to adopt that land. But people that live on those estates are still obliged to pay council tax. So yes, that's something that happens everywhere. And if you live on a private estate, then you're used to probably paying management fees and those sort of things as well on top of your service charges and those sorts of things. So again, it's always a good debatable point, but there's nothing there in relation to, I suppose, what else we could do differently in relation to that, because what we wouldn't do, we wouldn't be taking on unadoptable highway land unless it was at the correct condition with the right value of commuted sum that came with it, so we could maintain the asset for a significant period of time. And if that was not forthcoming, why would other taxpayers in the borough have to subsidise poor workmanship effectively that we wouldn't take on? So there's a lot there. There's a lot of detail in that one, but yes, good points. But again, all interconnected, I think, in relation to the other things we're talking about. So if we're talking about housing need and housing strategy, we need to be thinking about what is the need, because the shopping list can be as long as your arm. So in any one given week, I'm talking to Children's Services about care leaver accommodation. I'm talking to Matt in Children's about I need more dementia care units. We're then talking about we need more social housing accommodation. We're now talking about we need more accommodation for domestic abuse. We're then talking about more independent living accommodation for people, and then more generally affordable housing for people. My question is, can't do all of that. What's the priority? And that's my question, is what's number one, what's number two, what's number three, what's number four, what's number five? Yeah, so that's the challenge. So there could be a conversation around the housing strategy, prioritisation in relation to need going forward.
Okay, I'll bring a stop to that one. I know Shirley's got a question, and I know time is getting onwards here, so Shirley.
Thank you. My question is also about affordable housing, but not in the sense of new affordable housing, which obviously is, you know, hugely important. But I'm really concerned that we have a two-tier system of affordable housing in the borough. So we have our own council houses, and I think our tenants, I'm a member of TLIP, and I think that our tenants are very satisfied and well provided for, whereas a lot of the people who are in housing associations are not. And we have these preferred registered providers, and I do believe that the contract that we have with those providers comes up for renewal, I think, next year. And I think this should be something that's on our radar. And I think we really need to be looking at this to say we want the same standard for those people who are living in housing association properties as are living in, you know, we should be aiming really high. And if they can't come up with the same standard for repairs and quality of housing, then they shouldn't be preferred registered providers. So I kind of wonder whether we need a task and finish group or something like that to get ahead of ourselves with that particular contract.
Chair, if I may,
Yep.
Shirley, I think that's an excellent point. Something I've already raised. So we don't have a large social housing stock ourselves. We've got about 2,800, which is not a lot in relative terms. To other local authorities. Some local authorities transferred their stock out many years ago. They have none, and they're completely reliant on RPs. And the word RP is interesting in itself, isn't it? Because there used to be RSLs. So you know, that's registered social landlord. Then registered social landlord became registered provider. Yeah, and all of a sudden you can, you know, for me, I think you start seeing the dilution of the social bit. Yeah, and it starts to become more commercial model going forward. So you're right. I think that renewal of those contracts is up this year, Shirley. So I think I need to take it away and find out, because I think it could be very timely having this conversation, I think, in the next couple of months. But absolutely, whether we get the right level of nominations from them. So do we get our fair share of social housing nominations from them? Is there more they can do? Should we really be more demanding of them in the nicest way and working in partnership with them? Because we want to work with RPs who want to work with us. And obviously, it's not about just making profit. It's about obviously making sure that we're delivering against our need in the borough. So you're absolutely right, because what we do have in this borough, and should be very proud about it, is the 2,800 units you do have in this borough, and the way that we look after our residents as social council tenants is one of the best I've seen, actually. I think we're really good at it. I think you've seen the Gorside development happening. We've got an organisation called TLIP, which is chaired by Steve Bowers, who's excellent at what he does in relation to bringing the tenants together again and getting their views and feelings and feeding into how we're shaping services for local tenants and those sort of things. That is not replicated in the RP area, or not to that extent, and that's your two-tier sort of argument, Shirley. So I think it's a fair one. I'm not sitting here gunning for the RPs or saying they're not doing a good job, but I think what we do need to do is we have to have that more roundy conversation about how do we bring this to a one-tiered approach and make it more fair for all. So if you're in social housing in Wokingham, your experience is the same, irrespective of whether you're in an RP property or whether you're in council stock.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly my thoughts. I just don't think that we should have this two-tier system, you know, certainly for things like repairs and a general standard of accommodation. Thanks.
Okay, I'm not seeing any nods from anybody else in the room. I did have one, Steve, with strategic development locations. One of my biggies is about how we hold developers to account while they're building big areas, because they do seem to play rough and shoddy in terms of delivering facilities for the residents. And I feel that the council should be holding the developers to account, more to account, should I say.
Yes, I think we could certainly bring something to the committee to talk about our approach, what we do, some of the challenges. It's not always the developer's fault. We're also accountable from a timing point of view how things come online. But whenever you're doing big developments, you're always gonna, nothing falls together perfectly in a nice little timed way. There's always a lag on something as an area is developed. So it might be helpful if it was a topic you wanted to discuss where we could bring our approach to SDLs in relation to our planning, our timelines, our strategy, our communication and so on. We could cover that, I think. So we've got Trevor Saunders in his area as the interim AD of planning, and of course Connor in that area that leads on a lot of that. So we could certainly bring that to the committee if you want to dive into that a little bit more. But that list is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, obviously. So I see you've got a work planning session at the end of the agenda. So it'll be interesting to see what you wish to prioritise.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions for Steve? Are we going to? No. Okay, so we'll go on to. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Number 10, Resources and Assets Directorate priorities. That's Greg. Graham, sorry.
That's all right. Good evening, Chairman. Good evening, everyone. Yes, thanks for inviting me along to talk through. This is, as Steve talked about, this is from a director's perspective, what the big ticket items are in our domain. So I won't show this the slides because you have them in front of you, but I'll talk through them, and I'll start with what is page 1 of 5, but 31 on your agenda. So I'll just pick out the key themes around issues. So I've split this down into the significant pieces of work. I've also segregated the BAU and the COVID response recovery similarly to last year. Obviously, we're a lot less in response and we're in recovery, but we can't forget about what we need to be particularly mindful of in order to recover well. And Steve obviously referenced as well that there's an impact that flushes through. Taking leisure, massively impacted through COVID. We've had quite an ambitious leisure strategy, and the strategy's not long been approved, and the activities that we're trying to put in place to fulfill the objectives of that strategy, we're moving ahead with as speedily as we can. We know leisure is absolutely essential in terms of addressing the health and well-being agenda. So we do a lot of work around those vulnerable groups, and that becomes even more pressing in the context of recovery. So the vulnerable groups, for example, those maybe isolation and feeling disconnected from communities, particularly in the elderly or the older population, but also that applies to across all age ranges. So it's really important that we keep up with that, and we introduce mentor programs and all sorts, but we need to keep that offer going and make it feel as accessible as possible. So another real big one on the health and wellbeing agenda is the figures around obesity. The stats around obesity are quite shocking nationwide, even in Wokingham. They're quite startling, albeit in Wokingham we're considerably better ranked than elsewhere. So we need to try to attend to keeping people active, and that especially targeting the younger age group, where of course that can determine life patterns. The real big issue in leisure is the impact of COVID on what is a huge income generating activity. So we've got contract with Places Leisure, and their patronage has suffered significantly, and the tail of COVID is having an impact, and we're in continual negotiations with them. We were stymied in terms of what was seen as a force majeure, the requirement to lock them down, close them down, but also then it was about the restrictions that followed and the impact on that contractor. And we're having, obviously this is a public meeting, so I won't disclose anything further, but that's an important thing to work through with our contractor. Also in all of our what's called sports development, you could call it early intervention prevention programs, so things like the Steady Steps or the Shine program. We've lost a lot of the customer base there. Substantially due to COVID, but there were things that we probably could have transacted better throughout the year. But regardless, we need to recover leisure back to the place that it was, whilst we're also making some fantastic developments in the area. For example, Cantley Park, we talked about it. We've taken out to executive in the past, so an awful lot of offering has been enhanced there. We've new boxing hub in place, and I know we're continually looking to advance our sports and leisure offering to the public. I'll now move on to, I forgot to mention the Carnival Hub. That's pretty significant as well. So we're actually we're bucking the trend in many ways on leisure, whilst many authorities are closing leisure centres, particularly the wet area of leisure centres, swimming pools. We are looking to try and enhance our offering. So that covers up to page 32. There was quite a fair amount on leisure there, but obviously a very important and significant issue, both in terms of the health and well-being contribution, but the income generation as well. And as Steve pointed out, of course, if we want to have choices around our priorities, the more we can generate in terms of income, then the more choices we have around our priorities and accommodating them. Moving to governance, it starts with elections 22 because that falls in this financial year, but there'll also be an elections 23, so we'll be mobilising for that as well. There's a whole list of things in governance. I would point out the more obvious ones would be the decision around annual elections for yearly elections, the boundary review. We've also got a host of things to address, some of which were identified around through the corporate peer review, which includes looking at Scrutiny itself, how that works, how effective it is, comparing it with best practices elsewhere and how they're organised elsewhere. Also member development programs, so that will be important as well. So a whole host of things on governance. I'm sure you'll be acutely aware of many of those. Moving to financial management, Steve's referenced finances. This one starts off with, before we think about how much money we've got, before we move to that, is just the whole host of consideration and reporting and returns around financial management, some that sit with other committees, most particularly the audit committee. There's some of these are just single lines on this schedule here, so I'm on page 33, but the MTFP process, I mean, that's huge, and that's everything. That's all of our revenue, all of our capital, housing revenue account, dedicated schools grant. And the context of that is quite stark and I'm not talking about Wokingham right now, I'm talking nationally. Right up and down the country, the pressures facing local government are really severe. And that's as a result of inflationary pressures, the impact of COVID, the adult social care NHS reforms, which will soon, the impact of those will soon be upon us. And we've got, well, Steve's referenced quite a few things as well, for example, buses, but there's a whole host of pressures that fall under either impact of COVID and actually also there is an impact of Brexit, of course. The supply chain hasn't been immune from that, as you would expect. The war in Ukraine and all of that in the context of very little additional government funding. We were hoping for a 3-year local government finance settlement, and that's been promised many years. But again, we received just 1 year. So it's really difficult for me to give confidence around the challenges faced by local authority beyond this year. Obviously, I'm aware of the growth pressures or some of them emerging, but in terms of the money coming to support, that is unclear at the moment. So anyway, that's kind of, also the CFO report set out the financial landscape, and we did reference the potential for a mid-year review in the CFO report and overview and scrutiny. Mindful of that, when I presented to overview and scrutiny last time, have factored in a review in September of a potential proposals for a mid-year review. That may have to come forward. I don't know for sure yet, but anyway, that's a marker with regard to that. Within financial management, there's a whole host of other things like treasury management, procurement, contract management. Obviously, these things impact council-wide. So I'll just quickly reference commercialisation. We've recently had a commercialisation strategy and procurement strategy approved, and it's about enacting all of those. And you might think commercialisation is just about trying to make more money, new income lines, opening a cafe or a company or what have you, but it's much, much bigger than that. For me, it's as much about early intervention and prevention as it is about creating a new line of income. In fact, probably it will be more significant financially and less risky to invest in early intervention prevention than a new line of business. And flowing from that will be creating some really good business intelligence that shows the fruits and the pipeline. We talk about the dashboard in terms of showing the data insights around both procurement and commercialisation, but also being very clear about our pipeline in terms of procurement, knowing what's coming up 1 year ahead, 2 year ahead, 3 year ahead, and even beyond, so that we can make the best value for money considerations, rather than, if it's not working well, we move into a very reactive and almost roll over current contracts and what have you. They're not as well thought through as they would need to be. So again, just a small line there on what's called commercialisation, but an awful lot within that. Property, again, all sorts of things within there, but probably the substantial area to draw out is the delivery. So whatever is approved for delivery. So Steve, in many ways, is the commissioner, and then we move into delivery, whether that's course ride, whether that's carnival, whether that's solar farms, or what have you. But that's going to, or town centre regeneration, of course, is a form of delivery, and that will be coming to an end fairly soon at the end of an extremely long project. So as you see at the bottom, moving to page 35, so it says climate emergency projects because that's been talked about, but it's really making sure all our assets are used in the most optimal way to ensure they're fit for purpose for the service, whether this becomes surplus. Does that then mean they are better placed for another service, or is it disposal? Disposal gives you capital receipts. Capital receipts allows you to reinvest. So it's all of that consideration. Working with Steve is really important because Steve will also know the new line of asset through, for example, the SDLs. So we work extremely closely on that. Just moving to the very final one, external finance, I've called it, as so page 35. So this is really the council tax business rates. The rates, the collection here was just immense last year. So we understood the pressures and we adopted the CAB protocol, and we work closely with them. So we take a very compassionate approach, yet still manage to achieve 99.5%, which I'm certain will be the best in the country. There's staggeringly high collections. Business rates was about 99%. So our rates have remained incredibly high, but that doesn't mean we should lose focus here. We know things will be even harder now, and I know this doesn't fall directly under my remit here, but the tackling poverty agenda, council tax collection needs to be extremely mindful of that agenda and play into it, which it does. So that's about taking the compassionate approach and being very discerning in terms of there's those who choose not to pay and those who can't pay. I know it's not as simple as that, but it's about making sure we collect every penny that we can, because every penny goes back into the council to pay for all the things that the council needs to deliver for its community. However, there will be genuine hardship, and we need to obviously be extremely alive to that. So we will continue with that, obviously within all of the council tax and business rates. We have the grants, so the £150 for energy is being pushed out, and we have the whatever business rate scheme we have to implement, and a couple have just closed, but there's still another open. So it's been quite extensive in terms of the pressures in this area, both having a much more nuanced, considered approach to collection, whilst also pushing out all sorts of reliefs and support to businesses. And I think I'll stop there because it's probably best you get the chance to ask questions.
Anybody got any questions? Rochelle.
You didn't mention the intermediate risk management plan. Just curious, that's all. Or don't you do that in the council?
Okay, the risk management, the corporate risk register is produced by the corporate leadership team and presented to the audit committee. So we do that, I believe it's quarterly to audit committee. So the next audit committee will receive the updated corporate risk register. Obviously, risk management sits across all services, so each department will have a risk register and services below that. But those of the highest level of magnitude concern, which I could give you if you want, they are put forward on the corporate risk register in terms of likelihood of happening and impact if they happened. The local council's finances remains in the top right-hand quadrant and has been for some time and would be for pretty much every local authority in the country.
Shirley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Graham. What I was going to ask about really was the effect of inflation on some of these projects that are ongoing, some Gorse Ride and Carnival Pool and some of the leisure projects that are on the go. Obviously, there's going to be a hit to be taken somewhere. Or is there going to be a reduction of the standard of what we're building? Just wondered how the effect of inflation on construction costs is going to impact on these projects.
Yeah, that's a good question and a difficult one to answer fully, but I'll give it a go. We certainly, when inflation became evident, we started to factor it into our medium-term financial plan. So we felt it was most present to begin with in capital. So we went through all of our capital schemes this year and following year, and we put greater contingency in to cover that. We also, on revenue, that certainly with utilities, that kind of seemed to come up later in the day beyond the building costs, for example, on capital. We factored in, I think, up almost £8 million in the MTFP in revenue for inflation. Might even been higher than that. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that's enough, but I will say that's probably 3 times more than I remember putting in previously. So part of the answer is we were alive to this as we were setting the budget for 22-23 and went through and tried to provide sensibly. That's not being, say, in an alarmist way of which would then take resources out from many other services, but it was trying to do it in putting enough in, but just enough in, for example. There's also the fact that the prices, there's a potential the prices could go up in some areas and come down, and we noticed that in the building sector, for example. They did peak quite alarmingly, and they did settle back down again. I'm not saying they settled back down to the previous figures. So we factored where we could into the MTFP, both capital and revenue. We are keeping a close watching brief on the impact, and it may well be that we have to reconsider our capital programme and our revenue budgets, and that's, I've referenced the mid-year review, in the context of the impact of inflation. What I would say is inflation, the reason, sorry, before I go on there, inflation hits us in different ways. In some ways we're immune from it because we're tied into a contract. So you talked about Carnival Pool, I think in your impact on, well, we'd signed a contract. The contract have fixed prices, and same with the town centre regeneration, we were already. So where things were more maturely committed prior to the inflation kicking in, most notably a contract had been signed, and there couldn't be a reneging on it. Also, the highways was under a scape contract, so we're very fortunate there. So in quite not a lot, in a number of areas, we have been protected through contracts that have been signed and must be honoured. That, of course, won't protect us across the piece. So we're keeping a close review. Clearly, the revenue monitoring will reveal where we're struggling from those pressures. But what I would say is we're not going to be lazy or lackadaisical about this. If contractors are coming to us and asking for more money, that's council taxpayers' money, and we have made it incumbent across all of our contract managers that what they need to do is have tough negotiations with contractors to find out what can we do together in order to protect the council from this hike whilst not having a detrimental impact on service. So there are some rearrangements, reorganisations and what have you that can go on, or even just maybe possibilities of a future extensions or what have you. All sorts of things that we could consider to try to both contain costs whilst without having a detrimental impact on services. Part of in what I showed you was procurement and contract management. We have a strategic board and we have a subgroup of contract managers that are there as a support network, we're looking to upskill across the piece our contract managers, and part of that upskilling is to equip them with the best possible negotiation skills, because now is a good time to have such skills.
Definitely, definitely. And the concern I have is that if we're locked into a contract with certain contractors, and that they what happens if they go under because they can't afford to do the contract at the cost that they've said they do. But I'm guessing that that's where this good negotiating skills would come in, and that hopefully the council could work something out with the contractors.
Well, the point you raised there about a contractor going under, the only thing we can, if we're in contract, a long-term contract, the only thing we can do is keep the provider under review using our using the various tools that we can do to interrogate a company's welfare. It is difficult because that data is often quite historical. So yeah, part of keeping things under review is reviewing the financial welfare of our providers. A lot of our providers are, well, in the big spending areas, are large national players, so they should be in reasonable health. But of course, part of the checking of when we onboard is through the financial resilience, and all we can do is keep monitoring that. But if a contractor does, let's say, become bankrupt and liquidate at a moment's notice, then all we can do is find a speedy alternative provision. And we have had to do that in the past. We had a major contractor with the town centre regeneration that went broke and liquidated halfway through, and that crept up. Well, it didn't creep up, was bounced upon us very quickly.
Thank you, Graham.
Norman.
Thank you. Graham, on the ledger side of things, are things coming back after COVID, or are people doing things differently? Is there any sign that the sort of balance between activities is any different following COVID, or is everything coming back in the same sort of ratio?
Yeah, good question, Norman. It's no, things are coming back differently, and I'd say broadly speaking, the fit and healthy and confident are coming back much more quickly. So, for example, if you looked at particularly weights orientated classes, particularly heavier weights or really sporty high-end sport, they came back extremely quickly. They were the first to come back really quickly. So there were people at home jumping at the bit. I've got to get back to the gym and I've got to get my routine going or what have you. That's one end of the scale. The other end of the scale will be the frail, elderly individual who maybe needs to do some modest exercise, to do rehabilitation or what have you, or were part of the classes. So the sports development area I was talking about, the early intervention prevention, that is really hard because that's where the anxiety and the nervousness is. And at the moment, we're coming, yourselves, you're meeting physically at council, that's kind of back to normal. So we're thinking things are back to normal, but COVID's still with us, and there's many parts of our community that don't feel anything but back to normal, and therefore they really they're not ready. They're let's say resistant to joining in those classes amongst large cohorts. They still feel very nervous. Some very nervous about whether they catch COVID, and others maybe just nervous to leave the house. So certainly in our more vulnerable So that if I talked about sports development, Shine and all of that area, that's where we're finding the patronages membership is massively lower. However, in general leisure, it's coming back a lot more strongly. I think 70 to 80%, as opposed to much lower percentages elsewhere.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, no, have no other questions. Thank you, Graham.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So I'll leave now. Good evening. Bye.
Right, I'm going to have to take a comfort break for a second, so bear with me if anyone else wants to take one. Please do. Okay. Okay, shall we pull together to order, as they say? Right, so we're on to item 11, the work programme, to consider the work programme for 2023. So I'm going to look for some guidance here because it's the first time I've done this, so my apologies. We've got on page 37 the current purposes for the next 2 meetings, which then I guess the purpose here we've got to sort out for the follow-on ones for October, November. Do we do them in 2 monthly cycles or do we do all of them in one?
It's completely up to the committee chair. Shall I just run through very quickly what we have here and then I'll open it up to members to sort of discuss. So what you've got, as you've said on page 37 and 38, sort of what the previous committee agreed might be a reasonable sort of plan for the first 2 meetings of the year. So the previous committee was very keen to get the annual Community Safety Partnership update. It's very timely to get it because their annual report comes out at a similar time. Also, the previous committee was keen on getting an update on civil parking enforcement. We didn't have one last year. We had one, I think, the year prior. So again, that's up to this committee to decide whether that's a priority or not. Moving on to page 38, council-owned companies. Now, there's a lot of council-owned companies, relatively. and they haven't been scrutinised for some time. So again, it's deciding whether or not that's something that the committee wants to prioritise or incorporate into something else. And then, as Graham alluded to earlier, there's obviously the item about the mid-year budgetary position. So I would probably strongly recommend at the moment that we keep that in there, at least as a fail safe in case it is needed. You can add an additional item to either of these meetings if that's what you want. If you want to sort of use the whole time allocated to you, and then you've got your work program, the wider work program on page 39, which has a variety of things in there. Some sort of key ones to pick out perhaps are the arts and culture strategy. It's worth reviewing the implementation of that at some point this year. And then at the bottom, you'll notice there is also the borough-wide parking management strategy, which has sort of been alluded to in some degrees tonight. And then finally, on page 40, you've got the current meeting dates for the year and what's been provisionally scheduled, which at the moment is mostly the medium-term financial plan. And then the 6th of March, those are sort of the usual updates we get from some of our partners at the police and fire. And we also get our annual flood risk management update.
Thank you. So I think maybe a way to approach this, again, bearing in mind this is a new role of I have, is to think about, do we agree with the existing programme as set out, and then select which ones we'd like to go through, bearing in mind we've had the two directorates report to us as well. Is there anything on their list that we want to take out, and then talk about the dates as the last thing? Okay. Any disagreement? No. Okay. So are we happy with the plan for the subsequent two meetings of this group? Laura?
Based on what Steve said, I think it's quite urgent that we review the possible bus service provision that could be coming up, because we don't know what's going to happen with funding for the Department of Transport after September, and we know that a lot of our low-income residents rely on it. It's a lifeline. So it's just to get an understanding and be able to scrutinise what the possibilities are and what we can do to get ahead of that. And then also, I'm sorry if we're going to come to this later, building on what Gregor recommended as well, it would be good to get what Narinda recommended as to the domestic abuse KPIs, and also the breakdowns as to where the domestic abuse reports coming from, breakdown within the borough, because at the moment all we have is Woodley and Fields, wherever that is. So that would be really useful to scrutinise.
Thank you. Gregor?
Yeah, I would echo what Laura has just said. Possibly one to add for September. Having just brought the PPP back in-house, item number 11 on page 39, scrutinise the implementation of the in-house enforcement and safety service. I think it would be quite an important thing to do that, as it launched on, I believe, April the 1st. So we would hopefully have the first 3 months worth of data, insight, knowledge and understanding from them.
And you're proposing that to add that onto the September meeting?
Yes, because we would have the first quarter's worth of information. I would also suggest going forward, we probably want to review that on a quarterly basis.
Michelle?
Question. In that, reading the bus service, looking at the park and rides, because at this point, the Thames Valley Park and Ride is scheduled to end in about a week, and the Winnish Park and Ride is not going to resume yet because it's a commercial service by Reading Borough and by Reading Buses. Reading Buses is owned by Reading Borough Council, but they don't really do it because it's not making money.
Okay,
So
thank
we
you.
have to find somebody to pay for it if we want to keep any kind of park and ride service going in the borough.
Thank you. So I think Laura's brought up both the domestic abuse and you brought up the bus as well as Laura. Do we want to put either one of those into the July, September meetings?
I'd like to put the bus service provision in the July one, and then the domestic abuse one at the same time as Gregor's in 6 months' time.
So you're suggesting September for the domestic abuse?
Yep, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Norman?
I think, I mean, one of the more important things probably is the local plan update. Getting the sort of responses back in from the consultation, I think we should take something on that sooner rather than later as well. I think it would have to, if we're keeping the items in July one, probably the September one, I think.
Yeah, makes sense.
So currently then on the September one, that would mean we'd have 4 items. Oh, sorry, Callum.
If I could just
Neil.
clarify, Chairman, some of the items discussed tonight are already on the indicative forward programme for the Management Committee. So I think we probably have to have a conversation outside this meeting just to make sure we're dovetailing and there's not duplication about which of the committees is looking at which item. So I know for a fact that the local plan update is on the Management Committee forward programme. So it's just that clarity about which committee is looking at which item.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we can take away from this one is that we are interested in the local plan and that it needs to be scrutinised by some group and then needs to be fitted into the calendar of some group. So I think what we're highlighting here is these are things we think are priorities, and then we can take away which ones we can be responsible for. Pauline.
Thank you. Could somebody, I'm new to this, so could somebody explain to me what the remit of the Management Committee versus the Community and Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee are? Because last time I was on these, which is a long time ago, the Management Committee took reports from the scrutiny committees. It didn't really do scrutiny of its own. So I don't understand why the Management Committee would be scrutinising stuff that is in the remit of this committee and how you decide which one takes it.
If I can help, so it's the powers are set out in the Constitution, but because of the wide volume of stuff we've taken on over the past few years, there has to be, it couldn't all come to this committee because this committee spends a lot of time looking at the budget. So it's about trying to divide the work up to a sensible proportion for each committee and not taking on too much for each committee, because if we're doing too much, then we're not having a chance to actually focus.
So how do you decide which topics go to which?
Well, that's a discussion that's we have that when we set up the work programme at the start of the year, and then it's an ongoing discussion. I think that's the way it works. That's the way it has worked in the past.
Yeah, I'm just interested because I think members of this committee would probably like to talk about the local plan update. They may not necessarily be members of the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee, which has a defined membership, which includes the chairs and vice chairs of all of the scrutiny committees, which therefore skews its membership somewhat.
Yeah, and that could work, but it's that conversation that needs to happen outside this meeting, I would suggest.
Well, could I suggest that it would be good for this committee to look at the local plan update?
So what I will do, as Neil said, the Management Committee is made up of the Chair and the Vice Chair. I think you've given a fairly strong indication that we as a committee would like to scrutinise the LPU. So I will take that there. I will reiterate, in this respect, I will act outside of any political bias. I'll be fair. So I hope you believe me there. Go on.
Yeah, Chair, just picking up, I think, a point that I believe it was Shirley made earlier about the possible task and finish group on affordable housing and moving from a 2-tier, as you said, to a 1-tier. So that might just be something, as Steve indicated, that the committee, it might be quite poignant to do it sooner rather than later. So if you'll allow it, Chair, if I liaise with the director on that, and then as and when I will update the committee, and if you're happy, we'll set up a task and finish group on that from the membership of this committee.
Yes, please. Okay, so we have on the July meeting the 2 existing requests, the Community Safety Partnership update, which I think is important. That's you brought up, Gregor. The Civil Enforcement update, Civil Parking update, and then the bus issue. So can we put the bus stuff onto the July one?
I think currently, Chair, the buses, again, it's what Pauline's raised. The buses are on the Management Committee's forward programme for, I believe, July. So again, it's a case of whether or not that moves to here or whether that stays with the management committee for July, because they did look at, I believe, the end of last year. Did you look at one of the bus strategies?
Yes, the management committee looked at the partnership, which is going through at the moment, and that is due to come back. But again, I'm very happy to have that conversation about if this committee is keen to look at that. I'm very happy for that to come here. But again, we need to discuss that outside.
Yep, I think, well, we've given a strong pointer that we as a committee would like to see that come here. I think we're all kind of learning to see how we divvy up these things because, yeah, we'd like to see stuff, but other groups want to see stuff as well.
Thank you. Being pretty familiar with both of them, I think the bus discussion is probably more timely and more urgent than the CPE one. I think CPE could move around a bit whilst the bus one is more urgent.
Any comment on that one from anybody else? I'm more than happy. That's actually moving the civil parking enforcement update to a later meeting and to be replaced by the bus. Yeah. Yeah. Would September, if we have the domestic abuse and the sorry, there's a fourth one on that one. Yeah, the LP. So where would we defer the parking enforcement update? Would you want to put that to October? Sorry?
I was being a bit flippant, but I suggest do in Scrutiny Management Committee.
Sorry, Callum.
No, thank you, Chair. In terms of civil parking enforcement, it's possible that you could consider that still at the July meeting, even with the bus item. It would only be 3 items. The committee can go on till 10:30 and extend to 11 if they need to. That's not a target, but it's an option, obviously. So, I mean, my advice would be, I think you could probably get through that business in that one meeting, would be my advice.
Okay, we happy for that? Yep, okay, we'll keep that one there then. Norman?
I think really just experience from these scrutiny meetings, you shouldn't really have more than 4 items on the agenda. And to some extent, the discussion fills the time available. So, you know, 2 or 3 substantive items and maybe 1 smaller item is doable, but anything more than that, in my opinion, is pushing it somewhat.
Shirley?
Thank you. Yeah, something not on this list for consideration. I particularly think number 5, scrutinising the voluntary sector commissioning strategy, is really important because we are involving a lot more of the voluntary sector in helping to provide services. So I think it's certainly something that we should have a look at and maybe sort of set some kind of parameters for at some point. I'm not saying necessarily in July, but maybe you know, not too far ahead. I don't know what others think.
Oops. Okay, shall we just go through the list to see if there's any that are high ticket items that people do want, and then we can allocate them. So we've had Shirley put down for number 5, scrutinising the voluntary sector commission. Anybody else? Well, if we go through each of them in turn, I guess. Scrutinising the development of the council's budget 2023-24. I guess that, yeah, we have to. Yep. So that's a what is the time frame for that one?
Generally the committee, if you look on page 40, so generally the committee will start with an overview of the sort of a strategic look at the budget in October. November and December meetings are then usually occupied by looking at the various directorates' sort of spending targets, whether that's capital or revenue. And then the January meeting is sort of a bit of a mop-up meeting, because hopefully by that point we will have had the local government settlement, finance settlement, and it will then allow the committee to look at any updated bids in relation to that. And then obviously a report is then written, which then is sent to the executive for the budget, which accompanies the Budget Council in February.
Okay, so I guess we can pencil that in for, well, not pencil in, ink it in for those last 4 items then. Okay, moving on to the next one, reviewing the work of this community safety partnership and effectiveness of the local policing and fire services. Is that actually this March meeting?
So the March meeting, so March 2023 will be the police and fire, or that's at least what is provisionally scheduled. And the community safety partnership would be reviewed in July if you stick to the current schedule.
Okay. Exercising the council's flood risk management responsibilities by monitoring blah, blah, blah. Any comments on that one? Okay, not seeing any big takers. Go on, Callum.
That's considered usually again in March. So we've the previous committees just had their update. Again, it's relatively timely as it's sort of they've got quite a lot of data from the flooding season. Yeah, well, yes.
So we can, am I doing this right? So we put that one in March? Yep, okay. Reviewing the assets review program. I guess that's buildings and stuff.
And a tire warehouse in.
I can, it's not something that the committee specifically looked at in recent years. But if members are interested, I can ask Graham Ebers for his comment on that.
Yeah. Yep, okay, so get a definition of what the asset review program is. We've covered the voluntary sector commissioning strategy from Shirley. Scrutinising burial capacity across the borough and the council's plans to ensure adequate capacity.
Done that this year. We did it the previous year, didn't we? And at that point, the capacity was great. You know, there was plenty of capacity. So it, you know, maybe that we just get a written report, and if it's looking worrying, then we ask for some scrutiny later in the year, perhaps. Yeah.
That works for me. Any other comment from anybody else? Yep, great, thank you. Moving on to the next one, scrutinise the council's locality service and measures to develop closer working relationships with it, etc., etc. Al. Rochelle, could you turn your microphone off?
Just to say there was a I can't remember the call it now, a charter, a parish town borough charter, which popped up about a year ago, and we haven't heard anything about it since. So it might be, which was supposed to be about better working between the borough and the towns and parishes. So perhaps it would be worth asking where that's gone.
Okay. Yeah. Neil, then Gregor.
Just to clarify, we have the Borough Parish Forum, which looks at that relationship, and the voluntary sector part has already been covered in an earlier one. So maybe this is not, and the locality service has now been up and running for a while. So maybe this is not a priority issue.
Yeah, I was actually going to make the point that Neil has just made about the Borough Town Liaison Forum. I would, however, say that the locality service does involve quite a significant number of officers within our council, and so overseeing what it is that they're all doing and making sure that we get value for money out of that service would be quite an important thing to do. I'm not saying it needs to be done by this committee, but it does need to be done.
Okay, I guess that's an item for Neil to take away for the management committee to make sure it's divvied out. Okay, number 8, scrutinising service and policy developments related to the council's, etc. services. I've got a mark against that one as a, I think you gave us a lead on that one.
So yes, Chair, that's currently scheduled for the September meeting. That's one of the 2 in there.
I'd be very keen in that to see some data and proposed improvements for our ability to do proper case management and proper CRM rather than what we do at the moment. So I'm interested in the satisfaction of the residents. I'm interested in repeated failed demand. I'm interested in what proportion of how things progress through the system and what improvements we're going to make to that, so that people can actually see what they've reported and what the progress is and what the outcome is, and things don't get lost.
That goes to Steve's customer excellence plan. Yeah. So I think that's a good thing to go through. Number 9, reviewing highways and transport issues, including high-risk contracts. We've got bus is in that. Would that be covered in the bus service, or do we just want to isolate the bus service by itself?
This is a much bigger subject than just the bus service. This is a massive subject by itself. I don't think you could do all of that. You probably need to pick. Up to you what you pick, really.
Yeah, I agree. I think even if we take the bus strategy out, which we've said we'll take that out, that's still massive. You know, that could be 3 or 4 meetings, and you may want to pick one bit of it and scrutinise that. We couldn't possibly scrutinise all of that thoroughly. It wouldn't be scrutiny. It would just be listening to a report, basically.
Okay, that's fine. So we've taken the bus one. We're going to deal with that separately. We've got the car parking, which I guess could be covered by the civil parking enforcement update. I've got one which is I'm tremendously interested in, and I think Pauline knows, is I'm keen on cycling. I would like to see something on cycling. Gregor.
The other thing that I would be quite interested in is the customer service element of highways and transport issues. So things like when I report potholes, which I do on a regular basis, the speed at which they're responded to, the number of them that are then actioned, that are then filled, and the end-to-end process for that piece of customer service, because it's not handled by our customer service team.
Yeah.
Yep, that sounds like a good idea. Yep, everyone else? Chris.
Can I just ask a question, Greg? Does that include things like where the residents make an inquiry on the web page into Woking Borough Council about parking, residents parking permits and things like that? Is that response coming from an external service as well?
No, so we have an internal customer service team, and they deal with things like permit applications, blue badge applications. They'll deal with on-street on-street parking issues, but not parking enforcement. Things like pothole reporting, damage to highways, damage to pavements, tree encroachment over pavements and things like that. That is dealt with by Volker Highways. They have their own customer service team. There is an online portal that you can go into, and it is fantastic in terms of being able to report damage to roads. What happens after that, though, is not something that we as members readily get to see.
Yeah, that's my personal experience. You can shout, but you're not getting any responses.
I just add something to that. The actual front end, the map reporting is actually ours, and then it hands off to Volkers and creates tickets automatically. The key is the feedback, which is where I was talking about the end-to-end process of fault reporting and resolution, and also the end-to-end process of requests. It's the same thing, really. So you could possibly cover it in the customer excellence plan in terms of what the future's like, and maybe in here in terms of what the performance is.
Having been one of the people that has been writing the customer excellence plan, I can tell you that Volker Highways back end is not covered as part of the customer excellence plan at all.
Well, let's separate that and call that out as a separate item then. So we'll do that as the highways end-to-end reporting process, and then we've got the separate item of the customer excellence, which covers everyone for our residents. Rochelle.
I can talk to you about footpath accessibility. The big problem in a lot of our parks are that the footpaths are not accessible for people in wheelchairs or people with prams either. And there are a lot of complaints about that I've gotten from residents that they can't actually go there. They'd like to be able to go there, but they can't.
Okay, so
They've done something in Denton very good, because they've done, but they haven't done the rest of the parks.
yes.
I think if you want to scrutinise that, you would be sensible to scrutinise the local cycling or walking infrastructure plan, which will cover Peter's cycling, but will also cover the paths.
Yep. So we'll have the LC whip, which actually covers everything in those items. Scrutiny. Is that fair? Okay, going down on to number 10, scrutinising the council's art and culture strategy.
We haven't done that for a long time, but I'm on the Arts and Culture Working Group, and we haven't met for quite some considerable time. So I think it certainly might be timely for us to have a report just to see where it's at and why it's stalled.
I'm going to agree with that. I think one of the key things, bearing in mind, Steve brought up the refugee case, and I know with the schools I've talked to, we do have an influx of different cultures here, and actually this would fit within that. So I think I'm quite happy with that one. Gregor.
Chairman, at this point, I actually need to declare an interest because I am a trustee of Woking Moor Arts.
Thank you. Yes. So yes, we're happy with the arts and culture, bringing in how that unfolds with the incoming culture groups we have within our ethnicity groups within our community. Number 11, scrutinising the implementation of in-house enforcement. I've got that marked down as September. Number 12, scrutinising the council's housing services to ensure the needs of local residents and communities are being met. Does that include the housing associations?
No. That's. Sorry, I didn't hear that, Gregor.
Number 12, scrutinising the council's housing service to ensure that it meets the needs of residents, communities are being met. I would suggest that that's probably the objective of the task and finish group that you have proposed.
Yeah, this is specifically the council's housing. Yes, I guess, I think this probably is referring to our HRA houses rather than the broader sort of affordable housing in the borough. That's the only thing. I'm kind of guessing that maybe a report from TLIP would be would kind of cover that, rather than actually having because TLIP every month we have reports on everything, and it kind of scrutinise everything that's going on with our council housing. So maybe a report from TLIP to this committee would kind of suffice on that.
Hold on, Rochelle, hold on. Pauline's going to ask a question, sorry.
Thank you. I was just going to add to Shirley's point about TLIP. I mean, the other bits of housing are Gypsy and Traveller and all that sort of stuff, which aren't included in TLIP. So if you want to get a report, you could have TLIP, but you also need other aspects of the housing provision.
Okay,
sorry, and just to answer Rochelle's question, TLIP is Tenants Liaison Panel.
In acronyms, that what they actually mean, because a lot of the newer members have no clue what it is, and it would make it much better for them to know what they're talking about.
Okay, so just to make sure I've got clarity on that one, we want to report for item 12, say, we're going to have a TLIP, yep, report associated with the Gypsy and Traveller community. Do we want to include housing association issues within that? Okay. We don't need.
on TLIP, there is one rep from a housing association. We have a guy from Silver Homes who comes along to the meetings. But I think he's there more as part of a learning, for his learning, you know, to find out how the council do things rather than him, you know, he has a bit of input, but it's the essence of the meeting really is about how we interact with our tenants, how we provide council house services to our tenants, and we look at, you know, it looks at things like how much the rental income, what the arrears are, what forward plans there are for making improvements. The repairs, every month there's a report on how well we've done on repairs, and which is one of the things that really made me think about housing associations, because at the last TLIP we were having a long discussion about how we'd paid compensation to someone because they were without hot water for 2 days. And I've had a housing association tenant who's been without hot water for 8 weeks, you know, and this is the difference in service levels that is a concern. So, but TLIP is to do with our council tenants in our WBC housing.
The other thing TLIP does, or at least used to do, is look at future sites. So it comes with, I don't know if it still does, but it used to come with potential. Sorry, it used to come with potential future sites. So you'd have a discussion about people that were actually bidding for social housing, or bidding for development with social housing being part of that as well. Does it still do that? No. Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, used to.
Not recently.
Okay, so when would that be a good time for the group to come to report? Chris?
Sorry, do you have any ideas of when these groups meet that they can produce a report for us? I mean, we're suggesting times to have responses, but we need to get them to give us responses. So is there any planned activity for that group?
Okay, if you could do that, then let Callum know, then we can put it on the agenda.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to sort of bring sort of members' attention to the fact that obviously the 4 meetings, the October, November, December, January, the medium-term financial plan item is, as Shirley will tell you, is very heavy, and quite honestly, it can take the whole meeting just on that item. Members have identified a lot of various areas of significant interest tonight that want to be scrutinised. So the thing to think about really is whether or not those come to a committee meeting, whether that's a normal one or you organise an extraordinary, whether some of those are given to the management committee, whether some of them can be dealt with via task and finish groups outside of a committee meeting. So it's just to bring members' attention to that, because I say I've written down an awful lot of items, and it's going to be difficult to put them all on this existing programme and properly scrutinise them all. I think that's the key. You don't want to put something on there that will then impact on another one. And the only other item, just to add one more onto the list that Steve Moore mentioned earlier, which hasn't been touched on to my knowledge, is the homelessness issue. I'm not sure whether members want to try and include that in their work programme in some aspect.
Okay, so we have effectively limited slots on those dates and a whole grab bag of stuff, and it's actually prioritising those ones which gives the biggest bang for our buck. Callum just brought up the homelessness that Steve brought up. Consideration for that one? Do we put that as a priority? Al?
Homelessness was dealt with at the last Borough Parish Liaison Forum, so there was a presentation there.
So we're going to be talking about an economic crisis coming up. That's going to be coming along. That is going to be impacting people, and that is going to be impacting the community. So I imagine there could be quite a range of homelessness issues arising. So should we propose that one for October? Yes, nods? Not.
Yeah, I'd say yes to that because from the previous presentation we had earlier on about the Ukrainian issues, where we're going to have that possible problem of people that are no longer going to be hosted, that it's something we need to touch base earlier than later.
Neil?
Just from my experience, but as was mentioned, proper scrutiny involves in-depth analysis. So it actually involves going out to talking to people who are at the other end of these service deliveries from the council and partners. So there's very many ways of doing that. The task and finish group or individual members might want to go and visit people. So there's a load of flexibility. It shouldn't all be around this having a committee meeting. The committee's got the power to do whatever it wants in terms of that flexibility. And we can talk about how to do that as we go along.
Thank you. Okay. So Neil's just added another dimension to this, so we can actually go out and find the information. But if we put it on the agenda, then we can actually collate that information for that time, whoever it may be who gets that. And I guess we can actually look for volunteers within this group or just reach out. So the other one that Steve mentioned, which I think is important, is the refugee case, both the Ukrainians, Afghans and the asylum seekers. And I do think we're going to be seeing a pressure there. Thoughts?
Maybe that is definitely one for the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee because it covers health, it covers children's services and it covers community and corporate. So it would be better done at that level because then you can do the whole thing.
Yep, that's a good idea. Go down to, we've got the domestic abuse, that's down on the September. So that's come back with the KPIs. Right. So really, it's the list you've got. We've actually just got to pare that down and see what we can do with it.
Yes, so if I can just clarify what I believe members have agreed so far. So for July, members have asked for the bus strategy to come there, in addition to the two scheduled items. So that's civil parking enforcement and community safety partnership. So that's what I've got down for July. September, we've got council-owned companies, mid-year budgetary position. We've also got the implementation of the enforcement and safety service. And I've also got down on there the domestic abuse and local plan update. So that's an extremely heavy agenda. So it's either whether you split that somehow or put another meeting in September.
Might I suggest that council-owned companies could be wrapped up in their the supervisory element that they belong to, rather than being done separately. So instead of doing them separately, the housing companies could easily be wrapped up in the housing review. It's part of the same thing, rather than doing it separately, and then that would give you a bit more space for the other two.
Makes sense. Can you just go through those items again for September? I didn't catch one of them.
September currently. So if we omit council-owned companies to be sort of dealt with via other items, you've got the mid-year budgetary position, which has the potential to be very heavy. We've got the implementation of the in-house enforcement and safety service, so an update on that. The local plan update and the domestic abuse update, including the KPIs that members have asked for.
Shirley.
Under our previous chair, who was not averse to putting in extraordinary meetings, and we all groaned, but I wonder whether something like the local plan update is such a big discussion issue that maybe that would be the subject for a meeting all of its own, if we could squeeze in an extraordinary meeting.
I do think you are correct, and I do think it is a separate meeting. We did discuss putting that we would like to see the local plan update come to this meeting, and Neil did actually say there might be other places for it, but we can make the representation. We want it, and then if we all agreed, we can actually then call a specific meeting just to go through the local plan update. Yeah. So really, I guess we've got to talk about that, the management overview and scrutiny thing, and then fix a date. What's just as a finger in the air, what date would be kind of good? To be honest, I see this as a couple of meetings.
I think if I liaise with you outside of the meeting, Chair, and because part of it comes down to dates that other committee meetings aren't happening, and then I will then feed back to the committee and see if sort of a majority of members can make it, and if not, if substitutes can make it. But if you were looking to have it in September, then I would say perhaps a second meeting in September or early October.
Okay. So that just leaves that just leaves 4 issues again in September. So that one's dealt with. So over to October.
So with October, we've obviously got the start of the MTFP, which is going to be relatively heavy, but not as heavy as the subsequent 2 meetings. And then also members have just suggested potentially looking at homelessness in October as well. Or at least exploring the beginnings of that, potentially setting up another task and finish group or visiting, centres, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And it's now up to members whether or not they want to delve into November and December. But you've already got sort of a half-year programme set up now, and you can maybe consider those other meetings in July.
The thing is, I'm kind of would like to, because we've identified some issues there which are priority, and actually priorities do change, but I'd like to still see those on our radar, but then we can be adaptive and actually drop them or change them. So I'd still like to see sort of a grey area saying potentially these.
So some of the priorities that members have listed were the arts and culture strategy. So perhaps you could put that in November, because it shouldn't be a extraordinarily long update, hopefully. So you should be able to consider the MTFP fully in that, and also receive an update on arts and culture.
Okay, just to be clear, arts and culture, but also to include the other communities as well in that part.
Yes, the inclusion of it, that's fine. December. Members mentioned the LC whip. I'm not sure off the top of my head when the best time to review that would be, but that is obviously a priority for members. So whether that's the case that I liaise with officers and then look to schedule that in either December or January potentially.
Yeah, thank you. The LC whip's in the middle of being prioritised at the moment, so by December and January you should have an idea of where it's pointing at. If you want to influence where it's going to point, then you need to do it earlier, like now. But yeah.
And we've got anything for January or any more for December?
Well, just going back to the LC whip point, it's whatever members want. If Pauline's just mentioned that if members want to have input into the developing LC whip, then they'll need to review it sooner rather than later. Obviously, we've got full agendas again, whether that's something that can be looked at by management, whether that's another meeting that has to be arranged, or whether you just want to review it in December or January, sort of as when it's more formulated, but there's less room for change.
kind of hard because that one is quite close to my heart. So, but I realise there are other priorities on that.
If you want to do it earlier, you could switch it with the community safety partnership.
Is that possible? Squidge it in as Pauline suggests.
So would that be replacing the community safety partnership update and putting that to later in the year? Yeah, I can speak to officers about that. I know they've started writing the report, but there's no reason they can't then just update that later.
Yeah,
What members would
sorry.
prefer.
I do think the community safety partnership is actually an important aspect because it has, as Gregor said, it's been going since April. Just want to see where it is going. What else do we have on that July? Just remind me we've got on the July.
July, we have community safety partnership, civil parking enforcement and bus services.
So I feel that we could stick LC Whip in there. Yeah, make it a transport even. Does that give you enough to go on? Gives us enough to go on? Any comments?
No, I think we're good. I think we've scheduled up to December at this stage. It's whether members, as you said, want to put something in there now, or I think we can probably work with up to December for now and then discuss this more in July.
Yep. Okay. Any comments from anybody else? Is there any burning issue that you want to include? No. Okay. Do we consider this agenda item complete? You've got enough information there. Yeah. Okay. So moving on to the very final item, which is any other items which the chairman decides are urgent. The only thing I think that is going to be useful is we've got the training coming up for overview and scrutiny. That's going to be on the 9th of June, 7th. Oh, I tried either dates and it went all over the place. Oh well, but I think that's quite important that we understand that. I did attend it last year and intend to attend it this year. It does have some nice, useful stuff, I think, for us to learn how to do this stuff and be inquisitive. Okay, thank you. I guess that's the end of the meeting. Thank you.